Domi Reversy is a game, and games tend to have rules. For example, in Reversy, if a piece is outflanked by two pieces of the opposing color, then that piece gets flipped to that opposing color. That is how the Giants of Elbaf are being flipped to their dark demony sides, and that is exactly how Luffy is going to flip them, not just back to normal, no, more than that, but to flip them to their white sides, turning Domi Reversy into some sort of Domi Liberi, and potentially granting the Giants their own sun god forms to counter Emu's demons. And all Luffy needs to do to start the satisfactory flanking process is a second piece. And once you look at that, there's a jewelry Bonney sitting right there who also has the ability to take on the sun god form. Curious. So we currently conveniently have two white pieces to be placed on the Reversy board, and potentially up to two more, which we'll get into in a bit. But Domi Reversy isn't just a game. It acts as a metaphor for Luffy and Emu, who are interconnected opposites, aka two sides of the same coin. And what Domi Reversy does is accordingly the exact opposite of what Gear 5th provides. Domi Reversy robs targets of their freedom on three different levels. The first being the rather obvious freedom of movement, as you are now more or less a puppet of Emu. And freedom of movement is key to the endgame of One Piece, as Luffy will be physically liberating the world. And currently part of that liberation is theorized to be the tearing down of the Red Line, the reduction of the Void Century floodwaters, and the connection of every island in the world via land coming together to form One Piece. Luffy's done a fair bit of this style of liberation, albeit on smaller scales. Stuff like breaking out of Impel down in Doflamingo's birdcage. It is the most basic possible definition of freedom. But freedom doesn't just mean removing physical barriers. It is about equipping people with the inner freedom that they need to accomplish their own respective definitions of liberation. And this is what I refer to as freedom of the heart. An early example of this freedom would be Nami. She was never literally trapped or enslaved under Arlong. Arlong, unless you watch the live action, never physically changed Nami or anything like that, because he saw himself as above the methods of the filthy human world nobles. But what he did very successfully do was trap Nami's heart. Nami had complete physical freedom to go wherever she wanted, but her heart was confined in Kokoyashi Village. Similarly, Robin's I Want to Live is another early example of this. What Luffy needed to do was liberate Robin's heart before she would accept any kind of physical liberation, which Luffy could only accomplish by declaring war on the world government and promising to keep Robin safe from the world itself. It happens with antagonists quite often as well, with my go-to example always being Mr. Katakuri. During their fight battle in the Mirror World, Luffy was able to break Katakuri free from his prison of perfection. At the time, Katakuri was afraid to show his true self to anyone because in his mind, it would leave his family vulnerable. If those around him did not fear and respect him, then they would mock Katakuri and do other things like slice his little sister's face up. But Luffy was able to free Katakuri's heart and show him that there is a path forward through imperfection. And also that being laughed at and looked down upon isn't the weakness that Katakuri thought it was. And Katakuri most prominently displays this change physically by choosing to discard his scarf and willingly expose his face. However, I do think the best and most poignant example for this particular video would be Jewelry Bonney. Bonnie's liberation wasn't just about being free from being chased by the world government or about being free to sail with her father and go on the grand adventure he'd always promised her. No, Bonnie's liberation needed to come from the heart, which in this case had the physical manifestation of allowing Bonney to briefly access the sun god form that may go on to prove integral in the Elbaf arc. Jewelry Bonney is the second of what I promise will be a surprising amount of characters to take this form on, and I believe that this is going to be the counter to Domi Reversy. However, the final aspect of freedom that Emu's ability removes is the freedom to dream, which is different from freedom of the heart, which you can see in these broken middle generation characters like Crocodile and Gecko Moria. Their hearts have not been confined, but their dreams have been. Both of them initially set out to sea to become the Pirate King, and after devastating defeats, they lost the ability to dream. Although the sad thing is that most major characters in One Piece don't even need a Domi Reversy to be trapped, as they are born into a world that stands in opposition to the very concept of dreaming. Take Luffy wanting to become the Pirate King. It's only now, 3 decades into the series, that auxiliary characters are taking Luffy seriously when he says that he wants to become the Pirate King. For most of One Piece, he was laughed at, but it's not just him. Anyone who dares to dream is pretty brutally ripped apart, and I think the best instance of this is chapter 224, when Nami asks how they can get to Sky Island, and the entire bar in Mocktown erupts into laughter, with Oda also drawing a close-up of Nami being heavily embarrassed, and this right here is how dreams are destroyed destroyed in One Piece. It's not through violence, it's not through subjugation, it's not through any of that. Dreams are destroyed in this world through laughter and smiles. Because that is the inverse hell that Emu was set up, having corrupted all of the grand qualities of Nika and Joy Boy. And in the One Piece world, there's even a saying when people set sail to explore. A saying for people who, against all odds, continue to invest in the romance and fantasy of adventure, and who then proceed to get themselves killed in the process. And that saying is, they were lucky to die chasing their dream. It's quite a depressing saying, because it is highlighting the death aspect of these adventurers. But the subtext is that it's actually everyone who stayed trapped and lived who were the unlucky ones. The adventurers who died in pursuit of their dreams, they're the lucky ones. That's what made Roger's execution ever so powerful. One man, using his one life 24 years ago, managed to liberate the dreams of the entire planet. And within the great age of piracy, Roger created what I suppose we'd refer to as the luckiest generation in centuries. As plenty set sail and plenty met fail, but they were lucky to have experienced the freedom to dream. And I promise I'll move on and connect this to the solution to Domi Reversi in a second. But to really hammer this home, I want to highlight Zeph. Zeph was part of the generation who was inspired, and his dream was to find the All Blue. And even though Zeph failed and passed his dream on to Sanji, during his journey, Zeph was also lucky enough to discover a new dream, which was to open a restaurant. Not all treasure is tangible, and when seeking adventures through the freedom of the wide sea, you can stumble upon other treasures as well. And what Zeph found was a new dream, which he actually realized. And that is why the freedom to dream is so important. Because even if you cannot accomplish your initial dream, there should be nothing stopping you from creating as many dreams as you'd like. In theory anyway, in this world what's stopping you is Domi Reversi, and also other things. To some degree, I'd also argue that one of the key strangleholds that Emu keeps on this world is via financial freedom or lack thereof, because every nation that becomes part of the world government is forced to pay a fairly extreme regular tribute, which keeps these nations from ever building their economies to the point where they could even begin to challenge Marijoa as an entity. I'm not hugely concerned with that last one because it's not a factor in Domi Reversi, but I do think it is worth mentioning that Emu is searching for every way possible to take freedom away from the residents of the One Piece world. And to date, he's done quite well at that. And one of these methods includes the seemingly unorthodox idea of making people into kings. When Emu Domi Reversi Dory and Broggy, he stated, "Dory, the blue ogre, Broggy, the red ogre, I charge thee with dominance over this land. Thou shalt be kings." And initially, this sounds like Dory and Broggy, they're probably getting the better part of that deal. If you're going to be Domi Reversi, may as well be a king, because every other converted giant from here on out is just going to be some sort of soldier or minion. But to become a king is a curse. Historically, kings have been associated directly to a lack of freedom. If you become a king, yes, you have all of the wealth in the land, but you also have all of the responsibility, a complete loss of privacy, heavy restriction of movement, a complex series of social and political rules to follow, and someone always waiting around the corner to murder you and take your crown. There is a reason why Luffy doesn't want to become a traditional king, and it's because even in the best case scenario, it kinda sucks. And not only is Emu cursing Dory and Broggy with Luffy's worst nightmare, but he's also robbing them of their Elbathian pride by ordering them to kill Jarl, a man who cannot feasibly fight back against them, making engaging in combat with him a grave dishonor. And it also instills them with a focus and maybe even an addiction on raw power, which may initially seem in line with the giants, but it really isn't. The strength of the warriors of Elbaf comes from the heart and the spirit, which is why they so keenly accept someone like Usopp, who has shown those qualities. So Domi Reversi is very effectively robbing the giants of everything that makes them them. And now here's how we fix that. This ability demonstrably functions via Reversi rules. If any number of pieces of one color are caught between two pieces of the opposing color, then the pieces in between, they all flip. Just as the giants caught between the transformed Dory and Broggy were flipped into demon form. And demon is a very important word that Emu highlights when he says, "In exchange for some measure of thy lifespan, thou wilt receive an undying body and uncanny strength. Under fealty to Mu, thou art unbound by common sense and logic. Demons are the only proper form for life to take." Which is curious because Emu and the world government have gone on this whole campaign to label those carrying the will of D as demons. And Emu simultaneously is saying, well, that is the only proper form of life to take. So I suppose in that case, I don't necessarily disagree with him. But also Emu mentions that Dory and Broggy will now be unbound by common sense and logic, which sounds a lot like Luffy's Gear 5th form already. Emu's abilities appear to be the flip side of the gateway to ridiculousness that is Gear 5th. A nasty, grimy backdoor, because you would describe Luffy's abilities in the exact same way, unbound by common sense and logic. However, Luffy achieves that form through freedom rather than submission. So again, Luffy and Emu, they're two sides of the same coin and or Reversi piece, which I believe is represented almost literally with this Tommy Reversi game, which also follows the motif of duality that we've been discovering with all the sun god lore in Elbaf. According to the Harley text, the world has been destroyed twice in the past, and in each case the presence of Nika, the sun god, is closely tied to it. Is he the hero who appeared to save the world from disaster, the destroyer who lays waste to all? He appears when the world is about to undergo a great transformation. So all of this Tommy Reversi business is a small-scale version of Nika's arrival. It's a game played with pieces that can either be flipped white or black, in the context of the One Piece world to the extremes of either good or evil and or liberation and confinement. And when Nika gets involved in this game, it can go either way, with one side currently being played by a phallic-shaped pitch black silhouette, and the other side being played by Nika, who we've only seen as much more of a bright white silhouette. And I do suspect that if Luffy was to engage in this game of Reversy in his Gear 5th form, then he could flip the giants not just back to normal, but turning them into sun god forms. Because if they can become demons, then mate, they can become sun gods. The problem is that, according to the rules of Reversy, one piece can't really do anything on its own. You need two to trigger a flip. And that is very potentially where Jewelry Bonney could come back into play. Because on Elbaf right now, we do have two people who can assume the Nika form. Bonney can only do it very briefly, but even a few seconds should be enough to trigger a flip if Luffy and Bonney are positioned correctly. And once we have a couple of Gear 5th giants on our side, Bonney can just relax for the rest of the arc. However, I do want to point out that Bonney is not the only option for this, nor is she necessarily the most thematically appropriate. In fact, she may be the least likely option, as Bonnie's story was told on Egghead Island, and since then she has been almost surgically removed from any of the key action happening on Elbaf, as has Lilith. The two of them do tie into the greater saga, but Oda may choose to rest them here, like how the samurai got rested during Whole Cake Island, and like how Vivi was rested during Drum Island. Because sure, Bonney may be able to technically solve our problems, but is that really the best way to tell the story of the people of Elbaf? Not necessarily. Although I do like the idea of Bonney using her newfound liberation and spreading that to others. Even so, I've brought this up many times before because I believe that it was extremely intentional, but Oda may have given away the answer to this game in chapter 1136, as this is the chapter where we see a silhouetted Loki in a flashback, assuming Luffy's Gear 5th pose, and slightly before then we see Colin running in the foreground in the sun god Nika pose, which could be foreshadowing for either one of them to become the second piece we need to start flipping the giants. Colin is very directly inspired by Vicky the Viking, which is what directly inspired One Piece, so he is practically built to be a protagonist here. However, Loki, I would say, is more directly relevant, as he is the specific emotional center at the moment. Loki is very much the Bonney of this arc, and he is also claimed to be the sun god himself, so it would make all the sense in the third world if Loki did actually end up being able to assume the Nika form somehow. Maybe it has to do with his devil fruit, just as Bonnie's transformation had to do with hers, and it was up to both Luffy and Loki to tag team and Reversy all of the other giants. But it's not as if we just need to choose one of these characters either. All three characters could be an option: Bonney, Colin, and Loki. Now there is a slight logistical issue with this idea though, which is imagining someone explaining the rules of Reversy to Luffy, and him actually, taking that information in and being able to move about strategically with someone else. I don't know if Luffy's really capable of that, but he is the kind of guy who could also accidentally stumble into the right spot. Or more likely, whoever his partner is would have to work around his movements, which is very much the Trafalgar Law style of babysitting alliances. But everything to this point just seems so perfectly set up for this to play out as a game of Reversy would. Not just mechanically, but also thematically, with Luffy and Emu being set up as opposites and potential direct counters to one another. It could even be a situation where Emu's powers weren't originally intended to act as a game, but Luffy's ridiculousness manages to take control and morph it into a game. Because basic Luffy logic would be to see a ton of giants trapped and confined in these demon forms, and he would think to himself, well, how do we make my friends feel free again? Well, Gear 5th, that feels pretty good to me, so why not just do that to all of them as well? And honestly, part of this is just me really hoping that we'll get to see a whole army of Gear 5th giants, because the image in my head is pretty amazing. But the other part of me sees it as possible because the giants do actually worship Nika. And Bonney has now begun what could be a trend of people who genuinely believe in and Nika actually being able to achieve that level of freedom for themselves. The Giants are a society that, like the Buccaneers, worship Nika, as do the Lunarians, the remnants of which we may also see achieve this form in the future, or perhaps only King if he is indeed the last one left. But also, we need to talk about how Gonko fits into this. Emu clearly has Gonko under some sort of mind control or otherwise pseudo-coercive manipulation, and it may not be Domi Reversy, but it does appear to be something similar. A power that purges Gonko's memories, and it could be possible that an unintended consequence of figuring out how to free the Giants could also be a clue to freeing Gonko from Emu's spell. Luffy could Reversy Gonko either on purpose or by accident, and free her from Emu's influence and connection. And look, I'm not saying that we will see a Gear 5th Gonko, but I'm also not saying that either. And this may not play out like straight Reversy either. It would be a very One Piece maneuver for Oda to require his characters to demonstrate their inner willpower as part of breaking the spell, which Rox sort of did after he was ensnared by it, and he wasn't fully captured by Domi Reversy until Emu threatened King Harold, hinting that emotional state may play a big role in the control of Domi Reversy, and in which case a key aspect of a successful hypothetical Domi Liberi would be Luffy's wacky antics being able to influence the mood of the captured Giants even slightly to give them a crack of a smile that provides them a crack in the ability that Luffy could go on to exploit and liberate the entirety of Elbaf. There are 6 different possible locations for the next One Piece arc, something we should well and truly be talking about right here, right now, as Elbaf is primed to enter its climax, and we need to start considering how One Piece overall is going to end. Which brings us to quite possibly the most obvious choice for the next arc, which would be to finally visit the island of Laugh Tale, so that Luffy can claim the One Piece, become the Pirate King, and bring this story to an end. We are in the final saga after all. It makes sense that it would now be time to start actually wrapping things up, but this is not quite that simple. The next arc taking place on Laugh Tale is only really a possibility if we discover the 4th road poneglyph as part of the Elbaf arc, which isn't out of the question, and Copacabana is currently on the short list of theorized candidates to be the man marked by flames due to the flame-like scar on his face, and Elbaf may actually be the best possible location in the world to hide a road poneglyph, because very few pirates are arrogant enough to invade a land of giant warriors, especially if an Emperor of the Sea happens to be docked there at the same time. Just kid. I mean, there was that one guy, but most people aren't going to be kidding themselves into oblivion. But the issue with the road poneglyph being on Elbaf is that it's currently, I think, implied that the final road poneglyph is always in transit. The man marked by flames travels aboard this pitch black ship, much like Dragon ship, I should say, another on the short list of theorized candidates, and our last mystery cube is assumedly always traveling with him, and therefore is not somewhere stationary on Elbaf. What it comes down to is that if we do not find the final road poneglyph as part of Elbaf, then there will be at least one more arc before Laugh Tale. It might not be something as long as Egghead or Elbaf, but given our current chapter publishing rate of about 30 chapters a year, even something short ends up adding a lot of real-world time to what remains of One Piece. But to throw something unusual that really shouldn't be unusual out there, let's say that we are only main questing from here on out, no more distractions, and our challenge it is to find the man marked by flames sailing on that black ship. That could mean that the next arc may not take place on an island at all, but instead somewhere on the sea. That is something that shockingly we've never really seen in One Piece. The closest example we have is Baratie, but we've never been able to see a full-on showcase of pirate warfare in their native element. One of my absolute favorite moments of the Wano arc was the end of chapter 974, which gave us the iconic Luffy line, "When you're at sea, you fight against pirates." And I was so unbelievably hyped when I read that line, but once I'd finally calmed my farm, I realized that that is not at all true for One Piece, because pirates in this series tend to be incredibly landlocked. Most of the biggest pirating names in this world, the emperors, the warlords, etc., they function much less like pirates and more like kings with an extended navy. And I imagine that this is on purpose, because Oda likes to contrast these more traditional powers against against Luffy by showing how trapped the big name pirates are within their territories, organizations, and responsibilities, whilst Luffy has none of that to deal with and has the freedom to do whatever he wants at any given moment. And that freedom is quite enviable. But look, we're not messing around anymore. We currently have a 4-way race to become the next Pirate King. And it's not just Luffy who knows about the man marked by flames. The Blackbeard pirates have directly mentioned him. The Red Hair pirates probably know what actually happened to the final red poneglyph, which Shanks has already seen before. And as for Buggy and Crossguild, look, they'll find out somehow because it is the most fun option. And what I think would be really cool, and I get that this is going to sound like pretty cringy fanfic, but what I think would be cool would be for all 4 emperors to converge on the man marked by flames at the same time, because they all need to get that one last poneglyph to get to Laugh Tale. And maybe that turns out to be a full-on 4-way pirate war on the sea, or perhaps something more civilized like a 4-way Davy Back fight with the key to Laugh Tale at stake, in addition to any other poneglyph rubbings that various crews may or may not need. I just want one arc in One Piece that feels classically piratey, something that takes place in some extremely dangerous patch of ocean somewhere in the New World. And various sectors of ocean have been named, like Ed Wharf, for example. This is the patch of water where Golden Lion Shiki faced off against the Roger Pirates, so we could still have a cool location-based name for a sea arc. But if Oda doesn't want to set an entire arc at sea, then he also has a ton of other options as well, including one very important island that often gets forgotten about. In chapter 820, a tall dog named Inuarashi took quite the lore dump that the responsible Straw Hats proceeded to scoop up and dispose of, like responsible dog owners, not in my area, no. And he stated, "If you are curious to see where this log pose leads you, you are free to follow it. There is a point where all 3 needles point you to the same location. Normally, it is when you reach the log's endpoint that you come to a realization about the mystery of the ancient writing on the poneglyphs, and the civilization that gave birth to them, and the existence of Raftel, the final unseen island." Inuarashi says Raftel because this is before the Laugh Tale reveal, which he wouldn't have known about because Inuarashi and Nekomamushi were not with the Roger Pirates when they named it. But what Inuarashi was referring to is a Lodestar Island, the final reachable island in the New World that in the last 800 years, as far as we know, only the Roger Pirates have been able to set foot on. So this island, for all intents and purposes, seems to be as hard to get to as Laugh Tale is, and that difficulty was likely the purpose of that location, as this island reveals the secret that there are 30 poneglyphs scattered throughout the world should you not have noticed them during your initial journey, and this is an integral location set up by the figures of the Void Century to ensure that the voices of the past would live on, and that the world government would not be able to reach it to obliterate them. Now, in theory, there is no practical need to visit Lodestar Island that we're aware of, because we already know and have a rather large collection of poneglyphs, but this would still be a great and important location for an arc nonetheless. Firstly, because it is the final accessible point of the New World. There is an irresistible sense of challenge and adventure that I think would appeal to Luffy simply in trying to get there. Remembering that Luffy is not at all a practical captain. There was no real reason to risk his life sailing up the knock-up stream to Skypia other than to experience being there. And I mentioned it before, but this is about the key principle of freedom. Lodestar Island is one of the most impossible locations in this world to access, and if Luffy can't get there, then is he really the most free man in the world? Setting foot on this island almost feels like a prerequisite for Luffy to go on to meet his definition of becoming the Pirate King. And it would also serve an important narrative purpose, which is to give the Straw Hats permission to go backwards. I bring this up in a lot of videos because I think it's a huge element of the massive success of One Piece, but the story operates on a principle of always moving forward to the next adventure, always moving on to the next island in the Grand Line. However, once you get to Lodestar, there is no more forward left to go. You have completed it, which again gives us permission to go backwards and complete a lot of plot points that have been set up in the past, like reviving the frozen giants on Punk Hazard or dealing with Charlie's prophecy on Fishman Island. And in terms of functionality, there may even be a poneglyph on Lodestar Island itself that Robin needs to add to her collection, and it's also a location that contains a surprising amount of relevance for Nami's dream of mapping the world. Most of the One Piece world, it's already mapped in some way, but this island is not. No one has ever mapped it because no one has been able to get there except for Roger, and I doubt they bothered. So Nami theoretically cannot achieve her dream without going here at some point. But the island could also be the setting of a showdown between assorted emperors, or Lodestar Island could be something that we only see in a Roger flashback. I hope that the latter is not the case, because a Roger Roger flashback would probably mean that we only see one quick chapter of the island. And I know it's not Laugh Tale, it's not as important, but Lodestar is representative of what we've been working towards since the very beginning, which is constantly pushing forward in the grand line to find its endpoint. The point that Crocus told us to seek back in Reverse Mountain. So I do hope that the Straw Hats end up going here at some stage, but we do still have a lot of other options remaining as well. And the one that would excite me even more than Lodestar would be shooting off into space. If Luffy was ever told that space travel was possible, and that it was possible via balloons, then I would have a very hard time believing that he would not want to do it. And we have never had a better opportunity for a space journey than we do right here and now. We're already on Elbaf, the top point of which is practically the height of Sky Island, and we have Lilith's expertise to build us something to get there. But other than for the sake of fun, why is space in any way important? Good question. That would be because space, and specifically the ancient moon civilizations of One Piece, tell us a lot about how the world became what it is today. And it's quite likely that a lot of the grand technology of the ancient kingdom was created by these advanced Moonanites who fled their homes because they had consumed all of their natural resources. The story of the One Piece world does not entirely start on planet Blue Star itself. There is an extensive cosmic history on these moons that is criminally underexplored. And the importance of these moons is even highlighted in the Elbaf mural, where we can see at least 3 moons, and the rest of them are potentially there as well, but being covered up by the Harley text boxes. But here is what's most important. We've explored one of these moons during NL's cover story, but we don't have to go to that one. There are 6 other moons that we haven't explored at all, at least one of which is likely to be the home of the space pirates and could hold integral information at this stage in the story. There has never been a better time to go there because we are really on the cusp of heading into proper Void Century lore. But all of the stuff on the moons would tell us how the world got to that state to begin with. So we would know both what happened before the Void Century and what happened after, leaving that 100-year gap a true void until Oda finally decides to fill it in. There are a few problems with going to space though. The first is that even with all of the history available, it does seem like a huge narrative detour at the moment. Like, unless the road poneglyph is on one of the moons. And considering that Oda wasn't even originally going to Elbaf, asking for space, that might be tricky. It's also difficult to come up with the idea of who the antagonist would be in some sort of a space arc, as we are rapidly running out of villains to escalate into, to the point where we are now facing off against Emu on Elbaf, and it doesn't really get much higher than him. We've got our Blackbeards and our Sakazukis lurking for the endgame, but unless Oda ties a very major antagonist into it, I'm not sure if a space and or moon arc can happen. It's a lot more difficult than just say going to Lodestar Island, because it requires not only the Straw Hats having space travel, but also other factions being able to do it all of a sudden, or the difficulty of introducing an extraterrestrial antagonist and building them up to somehow be more threatening than the Emu we're facing right now. And it may be a setting best left for some sort of One Piece spin-off after the series ends, where whoever inherits the will of Luffy decides to become an astronaut and claim that he will one day be the most free person in the galaxy and or universe. Because you know that after One Piece ends, it's not going to end. I'm afraid the series makes far too much money, and it may not be Oda who continues it, but Shueisha or Toei, they are going to milk new content out of the teat of One Piece for the rest of, at the very least, of my life. To stay a bit more grounded though, there is always the potential of a Hachinosu arc coming after Elbaf as well. And Hachinosu, it does have several factors going for it, one of which is that it is the birthplace of modern piracy, and so it would almost feel like a rite of passage going through there. It's a piracy holy land in its own right, and I believe it's also fairly close to Elbaf, and there are a couple of people there that the Straw Hats, they do care about. Garp was captured during the sword raid on Hachinosu, so that may hold some significance for Luffy, but in addition to him, Charlotte Pudding is currently being held there as well, which certainly holds significance for Sanji, and probably the rest of the Whole Cake Island team to some degree as well. And I've mentioned the Davy backfight possibility in this video already, but if such a thing was to happen, then this is the best venue for it. Hachinosu is where the Davy backfight began, and it would be phenomenal if for whatever reason, all of our emperors ended up converging on the Holy Land of Piracy to engage in the most traditional of pirate contests. But what Hachinosu doesn't have going for it is that as an island, it's fairly well explored already. We spent a fair bit of time there with Sword as well as in this Rox flashback, so Oda might decide that this island is done and dedicate time to drawing something brand new instead. Hachinosu does also have a poneglyph, those are pretty important, but Robin may or may not already have have it. It really does depend on whether or not Trafalgar Law was nice enough to share his findings with her, because he had already obtained that poneglyph during the Rocky Port incident. I don't know though, Hachinosu to me it doesn't feel like the right answer. I'd be thrilled if it was, it sounds fun. But as we speak, Blackbeard is preparing to set sail to an unknown location with the bulk of his forces, and wherever that is, he would probably take Garp and put him with him to keep them defended. So there's not a lot about Hachinosu that currently strikes me as a must-visit location for the Straw Hats. It would be a lot of fun just because of the history of the island itself, but I don't really know how much there is left to discover there. So it's not my top choice going forward, however the toppest of choices would end up taking us backwards, as we should not dismiss the Holy Land of Marijoa being the setting of the next arc. And yes, this does somewhat break the rule of One Piece, which is that we don't go backwards, as the Holy Land is sitting all the way back at the halfway mark of the Grand Line above Fishman Island, but we could get to that mark possibly through another mark being the Mark of the Abyss. As far as we know, this mark can only travel people who share the mark, but Oda could make up anything to allow the Straw Hats to teleport to the Holy Land if need be. Narrative rules, they are flexible, which would be fun because it would get around the going backwards rule, and it could even be a natural escalation of Elbaf events, which are surprisingly world government centric, and I could see the Straw Hats setting their sights on the Holy Land if Emu is forced to retreat there with Gonko. Because as chill of a dude as Brook is, if Gonko does turn out to be his daughter as we suspect, then there is surely no way he's going to pull the Laboon excuse and ask Gonko to wait until he's completed his journey and made Luffy the Pirate King. And of course, someone else is already causing chaos on Marijoa as we speak, which is why Shamrock was summoned back from Elbaf. So there's a lot of potential for some serious escalation here involving multiple factions. And Marijoa could even end up being the Enies lobby to Elbaf's Water 7. It's not at all out of the question, although if we do end up liberating Gonko on Elbaf, then we would need a pretty big and major reason to go out of our way to hit up Marijoa. Meanwhile, other suggestions have also been made. For whatever reason, I've noticed a true surge in comments from people claiming that Vera will be the next island, which is one of the first Grand Line islands we ever learn the name of. And if you do not recall, this information was dropped in chapter 96, which stated that a coup had just occurred in Vera, so hinting towards some Revolutionary Army activities there. And so if we have a Revolutionary Army based arc, might not be a bad choice. And also because Vera is not a one-off island, it also makes an appearance later in chapter 228 when Vera comes up again in Nolan's logbook, then described as being a lively town 400 years ago. And Vera could very well be in the New World, because we know that Nolan made it all the way to Dressrosa at the very least. Personally, I would say that I'm not really on board with the Vera choo-choo train. I think it would be fun to explore on a cover story or in an SBS because there is a lot of history with it, but I do think we have better options for an actual arc. And when I asked all of you what those better options would be, an island for the next arc, I got suggestions such as Sniper Island, Emerald City, Australia, Russia, Your Mom's House, and the Straw Hats' adventures on Epstein Island. And as unlikely as all of those and all of my suggestions may sound, that is what is very special about current One Piece, which is that we are in an unknown. Elbaf was really the last island we were waiting for before Laugh Tale, and what comes in between those two locations is a beautiful mystery, because not knowing is what makes this an adventure. The Elbaf locals have emphasized the sun god taking on several forms: the Liberator, the Destroyer, the etc. Not familiar with that third one. So it's not out of the question that Loki has another model of the Nika fruit. So that is one of the most interesting things that I have heard in the past 45 minutes, and we are going to discuss it. Elbaf was said to possess a legendary devil fruit, one that gets passed down the royal line, but not necessarily consumed by the royal line, as it does not appear that Harold ate it, and it seems more likely that the fruit is being purposely kept and saved until a certain appointed time. And this fruit is assumed to be a sun god devil fruit. Quite controversial because we already have one of those. That's the implication that Rox made to child Loki anyway. When Loki claimed that Rox could be Nika, Rox said, "Nah mate, that's your dad maybe." And Loki himself has also claimed to be the sun god. And it has been stated that Loki ate the legendary devil fruit on the day that Harold died, and in fact it is commonly believed that Loki killed Harold in order to consume said fruit. Commonly believed by the characters in world, not by the readers. We're much more clever. And in fact, at the moment, we're not even 100% certain that Loki did eat the devil fruit. He was restrained using giant sea stone chains, and it does seem likely, but also it would be the most One Piece thing in the world for this to be a bait and switch and to have a heartfelt moment of Loki pretending to be restrained or some Oda crap along those lines. But the simplest solution at the moment is that Loki did indeed eat the fruit. But one of the questions we do have comes from chapter 1152, where we do actually see the chest containing the legendary devil fruit being encroached upon by an as of yet unidentified figure, with our best guess for this at the moment being a Holy Knight. But here's where things get confusing though, because this branches off into another theory. The idea here is that this Holy Knight successfully absconded with the fruit, and it ended up in the possession of the world government, being transported by Cypherpole at the time that Who's Who was a member, and that this is the fruit that Shanks and his crew stole, and that Luffy proceeded to accidentally on purpose eat, and now that is why he is awakening the sun god powers. That's one idea, that this legendary devil fruit of Elbaf was Luffy's fruit. And that may also explain why we haven't seen any Nika awakening since the days of the Void Century, because this fruit would have been kept securely until fate deemed it time to release it into the wild. And I think there is something to this through the Shanks connection as well. He's pretty heavily involved in Elbaf. In fact, he was even on the island the day that Harold was killed by the looks of it. Here you can see him in the home of Scopogaban, with Ripley looking at his tiny human penis whilst Harold was being impaled in Orist Castle. And so Shanks could have pursued the fruit after this incident, ending up in East Blue, or we could be very much overcomplicating things here, which I think is fair because we do have a literal sun god fruit in Monkey D. Luffy's possession. However, solution number the second is that this mysterious figure was about to obtain the legendary devil fruit of Elbaf, but was stopped by Loki, who consumed the fruit to protect it, and he was also granted what he believes to be sun god powers. So can both things be true? Could there be two sun god fruits that differ in their functionality and intent? Very possibly. This leans heavily on the Vegapunk hypothesis of devil fruit creation, but if we can't trust the conclusion of the smartest man in the world, then we cannot trust anything. His idea was that every devil fruit was the result of a dream of humanity and a possible path of evolution for the human race. And when it comes to the sun god Nika, there are two possible paths forward, those being liberation and destruction. Now, I've made many videos in the past pointing out that the two of these things are not mutually exclusive ideas. Luffy's acts of liberation do tend to involve quite a lot of destruction. We're talking entire islands worth of destruction sometimes. And so Luffy strikes me as a liberation via destruction kind of sun god. But could you also have an incarnation of Nika that works the other way around? A destruction via liberation kind of dude guy, representing different opposing dreams for humanity, but still using the Nika mythology as a basis. Seems a bit lazy initially, why have two fruits that are kind of the same thing but not, but that's just a standard in One Piece. Not all devil fruits are completely unique, and it's not even particularly uncommon for two fruits to be the result of similar but slightly different dreams. Your classic example of this is Miss Valentine's Kilo fruit versus the Ton fruit of Mark of Ice. Similar dreams, but one person decided to dream significantly bigger than the other. Officially, Monet's snow fruit and Kuzan's ice fruit fall into this category as well, as identified by Oda. And even Katakuri's Mochi Mochi no Mi ended up being weirdly similar to the base functionality of Luffy's devil fruit. That's not quite what we're looking at here though, at least I don't think so. Because those are all examples of devil fruits that have the same, or not the same, but a very similar purpose. Like they're going down the same path but wearing different shoes. Whereas what would be happening here with the second Nika fruit is an oppositional pair, which we also have examples of with Blackbeard's Darkness devil fruit and Kizaru's Light Logia. Those two are opposing forces. And to bring Kuzan back into things, he and Ace's devil fruits were opposing forces as well, as they cancelled each other out. However, Sakazuki's devil fruit, the Oda identified superior to Ace's, did manage to beat Kuzan. But here is the crack theory, right? Long ago, when devil fruits were being conjured into this world, there were two people of opposing ideals. Let's even go ahead and give them names, like say Davy Jones and Joy Boy. Both were individuals that had a particular dream for the future, and those dreams weren't completely out of line with one another. They both wanted to get to roughly the same place, but through wildly different methods. And so their desires became two different incarnations of the same idea, the Liberator and the Destroyer. And perhaps Loki, having maybe inherited the will of Rox, and I guess the will of Davy, is not lying when he claimed to be the sun god and the man who will bring the world to an end. We know the world's coming to an end, some man's gonna do it. But the only thing I would say that this risks conflicting with is Blackbeard's role. You would think that if anyone was going to inherit the will of Davy, then it would be him, and he does already have a dark fruit, which could be argued directly opposes the sun god fruit. And I'm all down for either one of them being a scarier, twisted destroyer take on Nika, as it reminds me a bit of Gonko and how she stated that Nika is her worst nightmare. And at the time you'd think, yes, Gonko, liberation is probably the worst nightmare of a filthy oppressor, given her status. But then again, this could be the actual Gonko speaking. There are parts of her persona that do remain, which is why she listens to Brook's music, and perhaps there is a legitimate reason out there to be afraid of Nika. And Gonko comes from a background that experienced the destroyer rather than the liberator. And if Loki did happen to possess the powers of a god of destruction, then I think that that would be one of the most terrifying things that we've ever seen. Remembering that this would be a mythical Zoan, but really it's just the Zoan part that's important in this, as Zoan fruits have lives and personalities of their own, and if a user isn't careful, that personality goes on to supersede their own, which is something that we're even somewhat seeing happen with Luffy in Gear 5th. He's having a lot of fun, but he's not quite himself in that form. He's always on a sun god high. But now imagine if your devil fruit power wasn't a rubber hose cartoon troll, and was instead an actual god of destruction salivating for said destruction. Loki may not have been playing the villain at all when it took all of the giants of Elbaf to bring him down. Instead, he may have briefly lost himself to the god of destruction, and if so, then freeing him is a legitimate danger for all involved, even Emu and the Holy Knights. I suppose we'll find out quickly enough though, because this is the only conclusion of Luffy being who he is. Liberator's gonna liberate, you know? Even if it means liberating the destroyer. Man on the internet, I think you should make a video about how Big Mom was right about how if Lola married Loki, she would have been king of the pirates, and how we all overlooked those words she spoke to Nami and Luffy. So the most recent flashback has definitely put Big Mom's previous words and even actions into a very different context. Her whole thing was about wanting to forge world peace extremely forcefully by incorporating every race in the world into her family, but Charlotte Linland's fixation was always on those giants. She even stated that if Lola had gotten married, oh, the power I'd have gained. And this is fun because the assumption here was that Linland was talking about an alliance with the Elbaf army, and that with that legion of giants on her side, she would steamroll everyone else through raw power, which made sense because she was also funneling money to Caesar Clown to create giants. And so this all came down to raw power maths, but as it turns out, that may not have been what she was talking about at all. Because Roxy Zebek gave each member of his crew the formula for world domination. That formula is Harold plus legendary fruit plus another fruit plus Galilard giants equals the toppling of the Holy Land of Marijoa. Rox repeatedly emphasized that Elbaf was the key. So Big Mom's not just thinking of the raw punch power. What Lola cost her was the devil fruit and the man capable of using it. And my assumption is that Harold was dead by the time that Loki proposed to Lola. I might be wrong about this, but Harold died 14 years ago and Lola would have only been 12 at the time. Not that child proposals are unprecedented in One Piece, with Vanderdecken proposing to a 6-year-old Shirahoshi. I'm not sure though, because you would think it was while Harold was alive, because after that point, no one's really following Loki because they all think he killed Harold. But from what we saw of Lola when she set out to sea, she was very adult. So whichever way it turns out, the point is that Big Mom would have either wanted Harold or saw Loki as the new Harold. A man who could eat the fruit, wield that fruit, and combined with the power of a large maternal figure, who probably thought of herself as a Rox level partner, together they could rule the world. And with that in mind, it is a bit easier to understand why Big Mom is always so angry whenever Lola or the giants are brought up, because from her perspective, there are not multiple paths to world domination. Rox had this one plan and he was pretty adamant that this was the only way. And so it seems like fate has conspired pretty heavily to block Big Mom specifically off from ever being able to implement the Rox formula. And with Loki's focus on destroying the world, who knows? Maybe he and Charlotte Linland actually would have been a real good team. The CP0 members on Wano were playing Reversy when they were waiting for orders. Foreshadowing? So I've had a lot of comments like this. I know the games do look similar, but the CP0 agents were actually playing Go, not Reversy or Othello. The main difference between the two games is that Reversy or Othello is about flipping your opponent's pieces, whilst Go Go is fundamentally a game about drawing borders and controlling territory with no peace flipping at all. Go is actually a game that's very world government coded though. Several people have also pointed out that this is what Garp and Kobe were playing in the One Piece live action. Should say those people didn't say Go, most of them also thought it was Reversy, and that the live action had some sort of Oda-granted insight into the future events. But Go is a game where you seek to control as much of the in-game world as possible. And I think some of the confusion might come from the perception that CP0 were flipping pieces from black to white during the raid on Onigashima, but unless that was something that was happening in the anime that I missed, I believe they were just replacing the black pieces with white pieces. And it should be said that they weren't actually playing Go, they were just using it as a fun illustrative tool, and if you know the rules of Go, then it's quite informative in every given situation it's shown in. This setup, for example, shows the white pieces being completely surrounded by black, meaning that black controls all of the territory on the board, and that the white pieces have been captured and they have no chance at all in the game. At this stage, the game is already over. That's where we began. And I do think that this game metaphor was very deliberate by Oda, because CP0 are agents of the world nobles, so of course they also turn their missions into games as well. It's just how they're taught to think about the world. Dear Internet Man, what's the chances of Roger's divine departure, that was also used by Shanks, will be the answer to Emu and Domi Reversi? So I do like where this thinking is going, but unfortunately we did already see this play out. Roger initially used divine departure in the big group attack, and Emu was able to regenerate from it with no issues at all, but I do like where your head is at, because we can't ignore the overt mentions to concepts like divinity, because they are becoming very important and very tangible these days. And think about it this way, someone taught Roger divine departure, most likely anyway, and he taught it to Shanks. So perhaps divine departure is another remnant of the Void Century, a move that has been passed down like the Straw Hat and like Binks Sasake, and originally it may have had some actual holy damage behind it. Although right now I think it does serve as a good dichotomy of Shanks. Shanks was born into a family of world nobles, people who proclaim themselves to be divine gods, but Shanks was only taught true divinity from his pirate dad, and is now more of an actual Holy Knight than any of those frauds on Marijoa. Wouldn't it be interesting though if the Holy Knights actually existed during the Void Century, but they served a purpose of general good, and Emu took that concept and corrupted it for himself. Kaido's perspective on a good death hits a little harder now that we know how Rox died. Maybe Kaido wanted to die in glorious battle because he knows what happened to his former captain. So Kaido did famously say that Roger and Whitebeard did it right, the did it being death, but Kaido never brought up Rox. And I get it from Kaido's perspective, this was not the way to go out. Kaido's POV is that Rox betrayed his crew, was promptly beaten, and slowly and quietly sank into the abyss of obscurity, but also the literal abyss of the ocean. Kaido's also tried to end his life many times in the series, so much so that people often ask, well, why doesn't he just chuck himself into the sea? That seems like a pretty simple way to make it work as a fruit user, but after knowing what happened to Rox, that is just not the way that Kaido's gonna want to go. It has to be something extravagant, like jumping off a sky island. That is memorable, whereas history isn't gonna mark your name if your cause of death was actually going in a bit too deep while bathing one day. Man on the internet takes any opportunity to shoehorn Bonney into every video just because she's Australian. So this is referring to the real world nationalities that Oda gave a ton of his characters. And you're damn right I'm going to take this opportunity as well, because Bonney, she's all we got. Well, not all. In theory, we also have Mino Koala, who I'm assuming is Australian and part Australian. And also that one zombie from Thriller Bark who was part kangaroo but mostly zebra in a bow tie. That's what we got as Australians to be proud of. So Aussie, Aussie, Aussie. I hope we get cover stories of the other Rox members who would eventually end up in Moria's army and see how they met their tragic fates. That is a fantastic idea for a cover story. I love it. And that's a problem, because if it doesn't happen now, I'm gonna be disappointed. It could work out really well though. I'm envisioning something like the Straw Hat Grand Fleet cover story where we spend 4 to 5 pages with each character of interest and we track the journeys of the less relevant Rox pirates like Captain John, Gansui, Silver Axe, Barbell, and maybe even some good old Gloriosa. And we do have some precedent for this. Generally, cover stories, they're designed to showcase tandem events in the modern timeline. So while the Straw Hats are over here, here's what someone over here is doing. But a lot of the Germa 66 cover story ended up being an excuse for a backdoor Vegapunk flashback. So I am 100% down for a Rox Pirates cover story. Because after the Yamato cover story, I think we need something of substance. The moon imagery in the drawing Oda made of Child Teach hits a lot harder considering who killed his father. So this is the moon imagery in question. For quite some time, this was the only hint we had for Blackbeard's past, and that hint was, well, it wasn't a very good time for him. That hint has since turned out to be true. It was not a good time for him, and I don't know if Oda intended this, but this drawing, it is indeed quite cruel in retrospect. You've got Blackbeard crying here, and the only thing he has for company is this prick of a crescent moon beaming down upon him, like Figgle and Garling constantly mocking Teach for being able to snipe a kill on that 1 HP Rox, and also more tragedy. One of the more adorable aspects of the God Valley flashback was, of course, baby Shanks. This little dude spent most of the incident blissfully asleep, dreaming of who knows what. I just know that it was a lot better than what was actually happening, and directly contrasting him, you have little Teach, who was wide awake, seeing all of the atrocities, and it is very possible that after this day, Teach was never able to fall asleep again. The 4 gods of the One Piece world mentioned in the Harley text were actually first mentioned during Skypia. In addition to that, Lightning God Enel was a test character for Demon God Emu. The promise between Noland and Kalgara became the foundation of the promise between Joy Boy and the ancient mermaid princess, and reigniting the light of Shandora was an early addition of bringing about the dawn of the world. As more and more time goes on, it's become clear that Skypia's function was a template arc. It was a beta test for the bigger story that is One Piece. And so understanding what happened on Skypia informs us not only of what happened all the way back when during the Void Century, but also what will happen all the way forward now in the final war. Skypia is where the meta story of One Piece really started to take form. It's where Oda decided to stop allowing so many distractions into the story, and he decided to truly focus on the setup of both the ancient history and the far future of the series. Prior to Skypia, the endgame of One Piece was never in sight, and arguably after Skypia it still wasn't, because almost nobody noticed the seeds that Oda planted right here with factors such as having Luffy take on the Nika silhouette for the first time in chapter 253, as well as Nolan's flashback being our first mention of the Sun God. And not only that, Skypia dropped a grand total of 4 gods, which is something that the Harley text has since gone on to confirm. There are 4 gods. The Skypia flashback specifically mentions the god of the sun, the god of the forest, god of the earth, and god of rain. And that last one there, that appears to have been retconned into the god of the sea by the Harley text. Although, because what we're talking about here is fictional history, it could be a misunderstanding or cultural mistranslation. But Skypia is also where the idea of gods is explored for the first time in general. Prior to this, One Piece hadn't touched the idea of faith at all, which has gone on to become an integral motif in the final saga, focusing on the faith of the Buccaneers, the Giants, and also likely the Lunarians, and specifically their faith in the sun god Nika. And so the first time you go through One Piece, there is this tendency to view Skypia as a glorified side story, like a season of filler. But in actuality, Skypia, it is the main questline. And a saga like Alabasta was more of a side story, which resulted from Eiichiro Oda arbitrarily creating 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 Warlords of the Sea, and then after choosing that number, needing to explore them. Whereas Skypia, due to the nature of its location, it was an arc where Oda could write with 0 distractions. We were on an isolated island. There were no marines, no world government, no rival warlords. In fact, no rival pirates at all, really. And all that Oda had to work with was the deep history of the world it is that he created. So let's start by looking at probably the most obvious key similarity, which is Enel and Emu. Both of these figures rule their respective worlds with near omniscient power, to the point of being able to erase entire islands that displease them, which Enel did with Angel Island, leaving a crater in the same shape as that circle in the ocean, where I am informed that Lucia didn't used to exist in. Emu's reasoning hasn't fully been made clear yet, but he appears to desire to flood the world and get rid of the eyesores of humanity. Emu is trying to create Mu's world, and in Mu's world there is no place for disgusting humans. And Enel was doing the same thing but in the sky. I'll do away with all the people unsuited for this sky. I'll return everything to its rightful shape. That is my duty as God. This is the sky. This is the domain of God. Everything's an eyesore. or people, trees, earth, all of it. Go back to where you belong. Enel's language is especially noteworthy here after reading chapter 1163, because Enel describes those who do not belong in the domain of the sky as eyesores, which is exactly how Emu refers to the marines and the pirates that he sees after taking command of Saint Saturn's body. He uses the word eyesore. It is very specific language, and most of the elders and Commonwealth nobles tend to describe humans as insects. And as we've already alluded to, Enel's arc maxim was strikingly similar to Emu's use of the ancient weapon Uranus. Enel, the surprise engineering genius that he genuinely is, even ended up creating his own rudimentary mother flame system powered by his access to infinite electricity via his devil fruit. And the language that one Gonko uses to describe the act of destroying Angel Island was that Enel, quote, completely erased it, which again is the same language that Emu and this time the Five Elders use for their assorted acts of nefarity as well, particularly when describing a light that needs to be erased from history. And quite frankly, what we could be seeing with Enel is an off-cycle god. According to the Harley text, each god has taken it in turns to create the world in their own image, and according to the prophecy, it is the sun god's turn next. But who knows, another few thousand years down the line, it could be the thunder god's turn, and whoever ends up with Enel's devil fruit will be selected by fate to remake the world in their image just as Enel wanted. And in regards to looking backwards to the Void Century, Enel is a god who took over from a previous god named Gonko, which is also in line with what we know of the Harley text, as prior to the sea god taking over and creating this world, it was allegedly under the domain of the forest god. And there's also something to be said in the idea that Luffy is Enel's natural counter, just as I imagine that Luffy, Joy Boy, I guess Nika, will also serve to be Emu's natural counter as well. But the golden city of Shandor is also a template for the great kingdom of the Void Century, with the Shandians themselves being a test case for the D-Clan, as Shandor was said to be wiped out and destroyed, with its descendants protecting what little remained of it and waiting for a certain day to arrive. Which sounds a lot like what we're doing right now, waiting for that certain day. But in the case of Shandor, this was on a much smaller scale. It was all about the poneglyph. They were waiting for the day when the purpose of the Great Cube would be fulfilled. And in the case of the Great Kingdom, they were and still are waiting for the dawn of the world. And just in case you had any doubt, listen to this, the words of Wiper. You can't topple the history of the proud warriors who lived in the land of Shandor. No matter where we are, our strength endures. We give birth to it and cultivate it. You can't topple that sublime power. No matter how much of the forest you burn, no matter how many ruins you crumble, the earth will not lose. And this is such a classic Will of D statement to make. It's also interesting that Wiper specifically makes note of two other substances, forest and earth, which each have their own respective gods. But what this is also doing is emphasizing the power of land. The earth will not lose feels especially potent in the grand scheme of One Piece, as the Void Century seems to have been a battle of land versus sea, a war that still rages on to this very day in Mu's incomplete world, with the sea in a superior position, and yet the land remains. It endures. However small and scattered the islands of the One Piece world may be, the land refuses to lose to the sea. And Skypia put further focus on the value of land by referring to it as Verth. To the people living on all of the clouds, Verth is this magical substance capable of both giving and sustaining life. And Gonko even comes to the conclusion that Verth is such a divine miracle that they never had the right to claim ownership of it. And Verth is also the treasure that could give us one of our potential answers as to what the actual One Piece is, which is the sunken world below the sea. And one day we will finally reunite the planet in one piece once that land finally sees the blissful light of dawn again. And of course, the Great Kingdom ended up vanishing from the world in the same way that Shandor did. Shandor was shot up into the sky, into the heavens. And look, if Uranus had anything to do with it, then the Great Kingdom was probably shot down into the sea to the depths of hell. But where the parallels become genuinely captivating for me, and not just parallels, is when we explore the promise that was made during the Void Century between Joy Boy and the Mermaid Princess. A promise which was not kept. And this exact same idea exists in the Skypia story, with Kalgara's promise to keep ringing the golden bell, the light of Shandor, so that Noland could return one day. And Noland's promise in return was, "We'll meet again, I promise you." And again, neither of these promises would be kept. And the Lion Noland children's book almost serves as the apology poneglyph that Joy Boy left. However, these promises would be fulfilled 400 years later by their descendants, Wiper and Mont Blanc Cricket, it, with the help of Mr. Monkey D. Luffy, of course, to actually ring the bell, to restore the light of Shandor. And I would personally also make the argument that Kalgara could be a bit of a template for Joy Boy's role during the Void Century. Kalgara was a warrior who fought with a smile, and one who was deliberately framed against the sun in the same way that only the most special of One Piece characters are, your Luffys, your Bonnies, etc. There's also the fact that the original sun god Nika silhouette looked very Shandian, very tribal, you see. And Kalgara himself, he had the role of bringing light and hope into the world. In fact, in Nolan's words, in the midst of a storm, this light extended a hand to us. Even though I shouldn't have been able to hear it through the storm, I heard the sound of this bell. And so Kalgara ringing the golden bell, the light of Shandor, I'm going to keep saying that, but Kalgara ringing the bell, it almost sounds like the drums of liberation. Kalgara was this beacon of musical quality, and the world only fell into despair once Kalgara lost access to the bell, and the world only properly regained hope once the bell was rung again, just like the re-emergence of the drums of liberation, or in the words of Gonko, the return of the song of the island. The unnamed Shandian chief stated that Kalgara's greatest regret was not being able to keep his promise to Noland. So Kalgara wasn't just going to war in the sky to defend his home from invaders, he was doing it to keep his promise. Which I think gives us a clue as to how Joy Boy failed. What probably happened is that somehow the drums of liberation disappeared. And from there, Joy Boy fought valiantly, but he was ultimately overcome and he left regret behind. And all of this will almost certainly play into the modern day as well, as Luffy is going to trigger the dawn of the world, but it's very unlikely that he's going to do it for the sake of the world or any big picture ambition, and instead he will more than likely do it as a favor or to keep a promise or for some other kind of selfish kind of small scale reasoning, just like how his driving force to beat NL was to ring the golden bell. Luffy didn't defeat NL and save Skypia because it was the right thing to do. He did it so that he could send a message to Cricket. And in Robin's words, isn't that a wonderful reason? He's a romantic. Even when things look hopeless, he would give up his chance to escape just for that. He's a bit crazy. And crazy though he may be, Luffy managed to simultaneously fulfill the will of both Noland and Kalgara, to keep the promise that they made to each other 400 years ago. And we were then given this by the narrator. The sound of the bell boasted the glories of the vanished city as the light of Shandor. It declared the end of the fighting with a love song, the song of the island. After being silenced for those 400 years, the golden bell fulfilled its promise. Now keep that text in mind, because I bet that we are going to hear something extremely similar when the dawn of the world does come about. Something about how the drums of liberation had been silenced for 800 years, and about the dawn of the world and fulfilling promises and all of the stuff. Especially since what Luffy unknowingly did on Skypia was end a 400-year-long war, which he'll do again, as Vegapunk stated that the Void Century War never actually ended. Ever since then, this world has been stuck in this 800-year-long war. And in addition to that, something that I almost never see mentioned in any Skypia discourse is that Skypia had its own equivalent of the Marines, a military faction known as the White Berets, led by one Captain McKinley, who wears his jacket in the same sort of style that all high-ranking Marines do, because they're all too cool to actually put their arms through their sleeves and such. And the White Berets for most of Skypia are a completely unreasonable antagonistic force. They are dead set on capturing and punishing the Straw Hats for committing a wide range of sky crimes. In fact, I believe that the Straw Hats commit at least 11 different classes of crime during their short time on Skypia, but the White Berets are almost like a parody of the Marines. However, if you do go through Skypia once again, I would say review their actions very carefully, because by the end of the Skypia, the White Berets decide to enact their own justice. They see NL for the devil that he is as opposed to a god, and they use all of their power to evacuate and protect the Sky citizens, which is very much in line with the Kobe philosophy of justice, to protect the lives of the innocent above all else, especially when you reside above all else. And so the White Berets are a small-scale representation of how I expect the Marines to be acting by the end of One Piece. Once they realize the purpose they're actually serving is an antithesis as to why they actually enlisted, they will have a choice to make. And it might not happen under the direct command of Sakazuki, because he's a bit of a wild card for the future, but I do think that the Marines en masse are going to have a huge wake-up call, and they will make the decision to enact the justice that they thought they were providing. And so those few 100,000 Marines will be busy saving people all over the world from whatever Emu's inevitable apocalyptic threat is going to be. And I also don't think that the Marines are going to collapse as an organization following the dawn of the world, as what happened to the White Berets after Skypia is that they rebranded themselves as God's Guards, incorporated members of the Shandian tribe, and they now work together to serve actual justice. And eventually, I do think that the Marine factions, they will unite and they will be serving justice under future Fleet Admiral Kobe. But we can and should also talk about the dawn of the world itself. Skypia was all about testing that idea. As the mantra of this arc, I've said it so many times during this video already, but it is bring back the light of Shandora. Now, the light of Shandora, it is a tangible item. It is the bell, an item hidden in a section of sky that has remained unreachable for centuries, and it was not found until the Roger pirates got to it, just like Laugh Tale in the bigger world. Roger, just as with the One Piece, couldn't do anything with the bell at the time. All he could do was read the message that was left for him. But Luffy, the second, or I guess third person to reach the bell, could. And what he did, he rang it. Dong. Just as Luffy will be able to use whatever the One Piece is because it will be the correct time. And during his final battle with NL, Luffy brings about a literal dawn as well by yelling, "Let the sun shine," as he dispelled NL's darkness. And the light that reached everyone after this moment was portrayed as particularly radiant, even more so than before NL cast the darkness. And it was like we were now living in an even brighter era than before. And I do think that we are going to go through a period of deep darkness in One Piece. That's just where we're heading. One where we won't see the light again until Luffy prevails and triggers the dawn of the world. And I do think that it's going to look stunningly similar to what happened here. Also, when NL is destroying Skypia, the Shandians, they are praying to Kalgara, but it is Luffy who answers those prayers. Just as in the modern day, we have people praying to Nika and Luffy answering. But on top of that, there's even a surprisingly compelling theory that Luffy himself is a descendant of the Shandian tribe and Kalgara himself. Because Luffy, he is a simple yet distinct character design in One Piece. There are a few people who look like him, such as young Goldie Roger, but there is only one character in the history of the series that looks exactly like Luffy, and that is Seto. This boy is just Luffy in Shandian cosplay, and Seto went on to marry Kalgara's daughter Moose, which is where the theory that Luffy could be a descendant of Kalgara comes from, and why it was all the more meaningful that Luffy was the one to reignite the light of Shandora, which resulted in the Shandians finally being able to reclaim their home. And at the end of One Piece, I believe that people all across the planet will be able to reclaim all of the lands that were swallowed up by the sea during the Void Century. And just on this whole world business, a lesser known quirk of One Piece is that author Eiichiro Oda writes a special comment that goes at the beginning of each new printed volume. They're usually completely useless information like, "Hey everybody, newsflash, if you ingest too much sugar because of an unbalanced diet, do not think you can correct it by eating too much sodium. Rawr." And look, I guess that's not entirely useless information, but at the same time, if you were the kind of person who needed to hear that, then you've probably got bigger problems. But occasionally, a very special comment pops up, such as the one Oda offered in volume 32, which notably is the volume where Luffy defeats NL, brings the sun back to Skypia, and restores the light of Shandora. And Oda's comment for this volume was, apparently, this world's going to turn out as expected. For those who expect that it won't turn out as expected, if it doesn't turn out as expected, it will have turned out as expected. So you see, the world's going to turn out as expected. Those are the cryptic words that he chose to say about the volume that gives away both the past and future of One Piece. So take that as you will, but from what we can gather here, this world is going to turn out as expected. Why is absolutely no one talking about the exclusive scene of Joy Boy in this week's anime episode? It's the first scene of the episode, an angel falling from the skies into the ocean, feathers all over the water's godly sound effects. Joy Boy is a Lunarian. Alright, this was something so insane that we do actually need to talk about it. The One Piece anime, it's well known for taking its own liberties from time to time, mostly by extending material and adding implied filler. Implied filler being events that were mentioned in the manga but not shown. The anime chooses to show them. But this, what happened in this episode, is an entirely different beast. At the very start of episode 1148, we have a rather artistic scene of what appears to be an angel falling from the sky. It's losing feathers feathers the entire way down, and we can also see that our angel, of course, has a defined head. Our angel then plunges into the ocean, and we get one last shot of these lingering white feathers as the angel sinks into the deep darkness. And then up pops the title, The Lost History, Joy Boy, the First Pirate. The implication via juxtaposition being that the scene we just saw was a depiction of Joy Boy, potentially even Joy Boy's final moments of life. And if so, then Joy Boy could be the only known devil fruit user to have drowned in One Piece. Despite the sea being the key weakness of fruit users, we've never actually known of anyone who has drowned in One Piece canon. Luffy, he goes for a swim and every now and then. And I guess in filler it's a bit different because Eric the Whirlwind almost certainly drowned after being kicked into Reverse Mountain, but we're going to continue ignoring him as we usually do. And I guess if you want to get technical, Jack has drowned, but he was a fishman, so it didn't result in the typical state of death that drowning would usually imply. Back to Joy Boy though, this scene, mate, it is wild because nothing like this exists in the manga. This is completely anime original material, and it has left a lot of viewers with the implication that Joy Boy was a Lunarian, and I can see why you would think that. Although you may also think that these white feathers would disqualify that sort of conclusion because Lunarians, they have these black wings according to a certain king. However, a Lunarian using Gear 5th would almost certainly have white feathers, so it does fit as far as that goes. But look, I've got two explanations for this. One is the boring, logical, unexciting, but most likely explanation, and the second is the one that I think most of us want to believe it is. But to start with the straightforward, episode 1148 adapts about 16 pages of manga across 2 chapters, the first of which is chapter 1114, which is titled The Wings of Icarus. And whilst Icarus isn't actually mentioned in this chapter, Vegapunk does do an homage to the story by claiming that he flew too close to the sun in his desire to push the world forward into the future, which is an obvious reference to the story of Icarus. And so the anime may have taken up that offer as a chance for, some filler by creating their own Icarus-inspired scene. And in this case, the winged figure here would be more of a metaphor for Dr. Vegapunk than Joy Boy, and it's just confusing people because it's juxtaposed directly against Joy Boy's name in the episode title, which is again, The Lost History, Joy Boy, the First Pirate. And that title, I should point out, is nowhere near close to the titles of either manga chapter that this episode adapts, which are again chapter 1114, The Wings of Icarus, but it also adapts part of chapter 1115, which is titled Pieces of a Continent. So the decision to go with a Joy Boy title, it is quite deliberate because the manga, again, it did not do this, and it does make me wonder if there is more to this opening than just some Icarus filler. Again, to be clear, I think that the most likely option is that this is just the anime looking for an excuse to animate a fun artsome scene, but it is also possible that One Piece is now getting to such a late stage that certain directors are told endgame elements of the series, which is not at all unprecedented. Several directors do actually know the ending of One Piece, and I've seen this old quote popping up from 2002 when Eiichiro Oda was talking about the anime. At the time he said, "In the animation, I don't really mind how any part is handled. So long as the people really think about the characters and love One Piece, then I think they can do anything." Which is essentially licensed to adapt One Piece however they want, which is how we got certain filler arcs. But also remember that this was said 23 years ago. I don't think that that is still 100% true today. And what the anime did here could turn out to be one of the more relevant pieces of foreshadowing in the entire series, whether it be accidental or intentional, if Joy Boy did turn out to be a Lunarian. Although right now, again, I think I need to stay on the skeptical side and say that this is just a combination of 2 factors that weren't necessarily meant to be related. One factor is the undeniable need for filler and the choice of being inspired by the story of Icarus, which again Vegapunk he does hint at, and the other factor is the completely separate decision of what to name the episode. Those choices, they were not made by the same people. And it could be that the unintended outcome of those separate choices has now combined to heavily imply to anime-only watchers that Joy Boy was indeed the winged figure being depicted. And that is not the only questionable winged figure that we're dealing with this week. Hey Internet Man, hand, one of Roger's crew has bat wings. You can see him carrying a treasure chest whilst near Ray Lee carrying Shaki. So yeah, we have a lot of wing talk today. And the commenter is referring to this guy in the bottom right hand side of this panel, as there is indeed a dude with bat-like wings. And the recent deluge of Domi Reversy content appears to have some people thinking that he was transformed by Emu, but this dude right here, his name is Duringo, and this is just how he is. We've seen him a ton of different times now in the background, as well as in Oda's sketches of the Roger Pirates. And there is this theory that there's actually a whole ton of secret bat people in the One Piece world, because Duringo isn't the only winged individual that we've ever seen. Charlotte Decroix, the 41st spawn to pop out of Big Mom's overly populated uterus, also has bat-like wings, much bigger wings mind you, although the most well-known example would be the current Vice Warden of Impel Down, Mr. Magellan. But as fun as some sort of secret bat race would be, in each of these cases it appears to be more of a fashion statement. During the Oden flashback, for example, Oda sent nudes of most of the Roger Pirates, which included Duringo, who you can see cheering in the background here with Inuarashi, but what you cannot see are any wings. And that's because Duringo's wings are part of his clothing, not part of his actual body. And it's more than likely that both Magellan and Hannibal wear wings ornamentally as well, to give themselves a more demonic impression, as Oda has drawn pictures of them as children and neither of them have wings, although this does get a bit confusing because in the From the Decks of the World cover story, when we catch up with Magellan, he has augmented his wings with metal, implying that they were part of his body and that he needed to have them fixed/repaired when they were damaged. Sort of like how Jesus Burgess plastered his face with metal after being burned ever so badly by that nasty Sabo. And if Magellan's wings were ornamental, then surely you just get new ones. So look, I'm not 100% sure, but it does appear that anyone with bat wings outside of Emu or Domi Reversy victims is more of an edgy fashion choice. I think it's time we question how evil Blackbeard is for stealing the Dark Fruit. If he is destined to play a role in defeating Emu, it makes sense he stole the only devil fruits that can presumably negate Domi Reversy and immortality. Maybe this is about more than just greed. So I think that this topic may go a bit deeper than what Oda intends to explore with One Piece. But as soon as you start talking about destiny and free will, we pretty quickly hit questions that can't be answered. Because Blackbeard certainly is a subject of fate, just like Luffy, and if it was his destiny to acquire the Darkness Fruit at this exact time and this exact place, then can he really be blamed for murdering Thatch? It seems like a really stupid question, but was Blackbeard really in charge of his actions if it was destiny that was commanding him? Officer, it was destiny who made me do it. And unfortunately, you can't ask the very same question of Luffy whenever fate really needs to step in and save him, which is a bit more awkward because Luffy, he's supposed to be this ultimate avatar of freedom. So it is rather ironic that his future also seems somewhat pre-written and scripted to a degree. Luffy's life, it's very much on rails with this whole prophecy business of bringing about the dawn of the world. But again, I don't know if Oda really wants us to look quite that deeply into it, which means that TLDR Blackbeard is a bad dude. Why is it so hard to fathom that Teach just evolved into who he is despite what his parents did for him to survive? It's hard to fathom mainly because One Piece, it is a fictional story, and that's just not very interesting. If the main antagonist of the entire series just so happened to adopt his extreme worldviews for no discernible reason. And you might think that we've already had a character like that with a certain Davy Jones, who famously said that humans had never done anything to him, but we actually got a very detailed explanation for how he became a phantom of hatred. It was because Hody and the rest of the new fisherman pirates, they were sponges for the feelings of the adults around them. And because the adult fishermen, like the Arlongs, they were expressing so much hatred towards humans, that hatred got soaked into the spongy goodness, and they inherited it, and they became it. They became phantoms of the hatred of generations before them. That's also why Otohime was so prepared to sacrifice herself for St. Mosgard. It wasn't just to provide them with a chance to live on the surface one day, but it was because she didn't want the next generation of children to watch that act of hatred and become another generation of Hodis. So if even the man who had no personal reason to evolve into what he is still had a very fleshed out history that told us exactly how he got to that point, then I do think it would be disappointing at the very least if Blackbeard did not. It took till you referred to Emu as he to realize I've always assumed Emu to be a woman, and I'm not really sure why. Well, I can give you two very powerful reasons why. But Emu, it is so fascinating to read all of your comments about Emu, because I get so many different commenters referring to him, her, they as so many different things. And I think that this is largely a product of the anime, because Emu's voice is deliberately layered with both masculine and feminine qualities. So it's kind of like that annoying white and gold or black and blue dress. A lot of people will hear Emu's dialogue and insist that Emu is a woman, whilst others will hear the exact opposite and insist that he's a man. Realistically, at this stage, I don't know if terms like man and woman can accurately describe whatever the crap it is Emu is, because we don't even know if Emu is a human or is it not that. And there's also a couple of people who do get a little bit frustrated that I don't use gender neutral terminology for Emu, because there is a lot we don't know, as I just admitted. But the one thing we do actually know is that Emu is 99.999% a he, because he is referred to with the male world noble honorific, which is sei, rather than gu, which is how female world nobles are referred to. And native Japanese speakers generally agree that Emu speaks like a man. And I also personally think that it's just the Occam's razor explanation given the obsession with Lily and Vivi, so until shown otherwise, that's just what we'll go with. About the World Noble's powers having something to do with control. Saint Summers makes thorns to make you do his bidding, while Gonko uses actual arrows to make things go her way, and Saint Gillingham controls dreams. This is such a great comment. In a previous video, I went into detail about the similarities between Doflamingo and Emu's abilities and how they are both based on removing freedom and taking control, but this is indeed a pattern throughout every World Noble who possesses a special power. And what's really cool is that they each take command of a different plane. With our Holy Knight, Saint Summers and his Thorn powers are very effective at removing freedom from the physical realm. Meanwhile, Saint Killingham operates in a very sinister space of the dream world, where you now have to police your own thoughts because they can be brought to life and used against you. And then you have Gonko, who uses her arrow ability to more or less control the future. So you're not safe in the past because that past brought you to the present. You're not safe in the present because thorns. You won't be safe in the future because these arrows are telling you what's going to happen to you. And you cannot even achieve escapism through dreaming, because anything you dream about can and will be used against you. And it really makes me wonder what ability Shamrock is going to have, if any. He doesn't need to be a fruit user, although I do think it would help distinguish him a bit more from Shanks if he was. But even if he isn't, Shamrock is still going to have his own unique exploration of control that I very much look forward to seeing. Little weird of Toei to start going seasonal when we are getting a new studio seasonal One Piece anyway soon. Brilliant topic. I don't think that it is weird at all. It makes ever so much sense. And I do think that this has been the plan for quite some time that Toei have been slowly transitioning into. And one of the factors that plays into that plan is of course the Wit Studio remake, which is called The One Piece, which we still have no idea when that will begin airing. However, what I'm imagining is that in the future, we will still have one episode of One Piece every week. It's just that not all of those episodes are going to be produced by Toei. So the way that anime seasons function is via a core system. There are 4 cores in a year, so they're 3-month blocks of about 12 episodes, sometimes more, sometimes less. And a single season of anime these days is generally divided into 2 cores. Generally, not always. So imagine that we have the first quarter of the year with, say, 13 episodes of the Toei anime. We're starting Elbaf, but then the second core of the year is 13 episodes of the Wit Studio remake, commencing from East Blue. And then the third quarter of the year, we're back to Toei, we're continuing Elbaf, and the final quarter of the year, we're back to the Wit Studio remake, continuing East Blue. And then we have 2 different One Piece series running in tandem, but also making sure not to step on each other. And I could be wrong, but look, if Toei really felt like they had to go seasonal to maintain, the integrity of the show, then that's something they would have done a long time ago. We're talking like 10 to 15 years ago. So as much as I do like their decision, I have to put on that cynical business hat and say that Toei are doing it now to make room for the Wit Studio remake and to make sure that Toei and Wit Studio are never directly competing with one another. Am I inexplicably awake at 3:30 in the morning watching a rather charming Australian man talk about fictional pirates again? Yes. Yes, I am. Yes, you are. And I'd like to extend a big welcome to everyone watching this channel at the witching hour, for whatever reason that may be. I know a lot of you who comment at these weird hours, you work overnight shifts. Meanwhile, the rest of you probably don't work at all. The scene in Post Marineford where Blackbeard offers to take Bonney as his wife just keeps getting creepier with the knowledge that Kuma saved a child that would destroy the pirate crew of his daughter. I mean, that scene was creepy enough originally that week when it happened, but it does keep getting worse and worse over time. Now, to be as fair as I can to one of the worst people that we all know, there is no way that Blackbeard knew Bonney's true age at the time that he made this advance, and he does ultimately reject Bonney for not being ladylike enough for him, so that's something. But here is our new twist on this. Not only did Kuma save Marshall D. Teach and thus ultimately construct this situation between Bonney and Blackbeard, but this isn't even the first time that Bonney has seen Blackbeard. Bonney saw her father's memories, and so she has actually seen the exact moment where her father saved the life of her future captor. Bonney may not have recognized Blackbeard as a child, but these two have such a convoluted connection to one another, and something that I hope will come to play in the future in a less creepy way. But I do also hope that we learn how much more Bonney knows about the God Valley incident that we didn't see during Eckert Island because we were too busy focusing on Kuma. Because after this flashback, we know that Bonney knows so much more than we thought it is she knew, and I want to know it. Did Eris and Teach go to Leloucia or some random place? Because Kuma never asked them where they wanted to go. So my guess is that they were sent to the Sorbet Kingdom. That's where Kuma, Ginny, and Ivankov ended up. And that's because to the best of our knowledge, Kuma can only send people to places that he's been. And rather depressingly at this stage in his life, where else has he been as a child other than the Sorbet Kingdom and Marijoa? So if the choices are Sorbet or the Holy Land, then we're going with Sorbet. But it could also be another option best described as somehow. You said Domi Reversi may work on people only when they are at their homes. Do we even know for sure what Luffy's birthplace is? We don't. What we know is that Luffy was raised on Dawn Island, but then again, so was Ace. And Ace wasn't born there, he popped out in South Blue, killed his mother doing so. So it does seem likely that Luffy was born somewhere else in the world and then given to Garp to raise by Dragon, who then took Luffy to Dawn Island. And if the Domi Reversi homeland theory does work out, then maybe we're in for a bit of a fun twist, right? Because imagine if Emu activates it, it affects Luffy, and we discover that he was actually born on Elbaf or Marijoa or Laugh Tale or any number of equally as ridiculous locations. Present day. Teach will interrogate Garp about Rox's actual fate. The old hero, the only living witness. I like that. I like it a lot, as this flashback definitely adds a lot to the current Hachinosu situation. The last time that we saw Monkey D. Garp was in chapter 1126, which was the very first chapter of Elbaf when Nami wakes up in the Lego castle at the same time that all of those shenanigans were happening. Garp was chained up and Blackbeard had only just gotten back to the island, and he was very, very pleased that Garp had been captured. And there's not a whole lot of reason to kill him, because Garp is the most valuable bargaining chip a Blackbeard could ever ask for. And Garp doesn't have a devil fruit, so there's really not a lot to gain from ending his life. And so this is just begging for a scene somewhere perhaps in between arcs of Blackbeard heading down or up, wherever Garp's cell is, to do a bit of gloating and maybe ask about his father, with Garp maybe clapping back that Teach ain't him, you're nothing like Rox, little boy. And even if Garp refused to tell Teach everything that he wanted to know, there is a reply in this thread suggesting that Blackbeard could use Pudding's memory powers to forcibly extract Rock's content from the mind brain of Garp, which could be very, very interesting. And it also serves as a weird flip of the Impel Down situation, where Garp visited Roger's child in chains, and now we could have Rox's child visiting Garp in chains. Both children somewhat despising Garp, admittedly one child significantly more than the other. And I suppose it all comes down to how much Blackbeard would actually care to see or hear about these memories, because we don't know how his thoughts about his father have formed over the years. His flagship is called the Saber of Zebek, so he probably has quite positive thoughts about Rox, but we don't know. And and there may even be some danger in showing Blackbeard how Rox's life actually ended with all the tears and everything. That may send Blackbeard over the edge by breaking whatever mental image he had of his father, but more importantly, what do you think the odds are of Blackbeard following perfectly in his father's footsteps, and instead of dying with a smile like most Will of D members, Blackbeard also meets his end in tears? Oh, and one point of order about this whole tears and the sadness business. I have a lot of people telling me that Rox laughed right before he was hit by Roger and Garp, and that's because his mouth noise was translated as vor by the scans, which initially appears to match Rox's laughing style of vor ha ha ha. And I'm not sure why they did this, as this is not the correct sound in Japanese. The more correct version is the official translation, which has Rox yelling va. In Japanese, it's just va, I believe, indicating more of a general scream and or roar. And at least one person has tried to convince me that Rox is smiling in this panel, and to that I say, mate, if you are 100% certain that that is what he's doing, then I want you to take a photo of yourself doing this exact smile and send it to me so that I can accurately assess your sanity. With that said, who knows? Maybe this is correct. We don't know what Rox was truly feeling on the inside, apart from the despair, the regret, and the frustration. But again, who knows? Maybe this could be his deda shishishi moment. Hey, Mr. Liam, have you seen the official colors of the Elbaf Gods Knights? With the confirmation of Gunko's hair color, I think the Emu body succession theory may have a lot more weight to it. So we do have some massive news in the realm of blue-haired women. Before we even get to Gunko, I think it's important to point out that Nefertari Lily's color scheme was also recently revealed in the anime, and I can't say that it was in any way a shock. As soon as I saw her, I was pretty confident that we were looking at a Vivi clone, or I guess more accurately, Vivi is a reincarnation of Lily. But in addition to that, Volume 113 also came out recently, which gave us the colors of the Elbaf Holy Knights. And Gunko is officially a blue-haired lady. You're still going to see her as green for a fair bit on this channel, because the animation's very resource intensive to change once we have them. Although, I don't know, it might be worth the extra work in this case, because usually the colors, I don't really care, they're quite superficial. But in Gunko's case, it is very possible that Emu has a fixation on her because of the blue hair. With Lily and Vivi, it's pretty clear that Emu has a type, and prior to Vivi's existence, if Emu was looking for something to fill that lily-shaped void, then Gunko could have been the solution he landed on, especially the Rox era Gunko, who even had long hair just like Lily and Vivi. And I was going to say that once she finally removes the face mask, she'll probably look like your standard female Oda design, aka she'll look like Vivi and Lily, but that may also be the reason why she wears the mask in the first place. If Gunko's facial features were more unique than your standard Oda woman, then Emu might even be forcing Gunko to wear the mask in order to keep the illusion alive or something like that. I don't know, probably not, but we can't just go ahead and ignore blue-haired women when it comes to Emu. As for the other Holy Knight, Shamrock, he looks exactly as expected, and I'm willing to accept that St. Summers is ginger, but the only one I'm a bit iffy on is St. Killingham. The black, yellow, and the orange combination doesn't really do it for me. Man on the internet, I don't understand this mass thing. Explain. Right, so according to Google, mass is a quantitative measure of inertia and a fundamental property of all matter. And part of the formula for weight is that weight equals mass times gravitational force. That's what mass is IRL. But how does this apply to fictional pirates? In chapter 1165, we have a fascinating discussion between a Garp and a Roger, where Roger states, "It all comes down to mass, doesn't it?" And then Garp asks, "What do you mean mass? It's not even Sunday," or whatever day various churches hold mass. I think it can be on any day. But Roger then states, "First of all, armament haki is a power that doesn't yield to devil fruits. And on top of that, I was wreathed in Conqueror's haki. There's no way it couldn't have hurt him." Garp then says, duh, because Rox was also guarding with Conqueror's haki. But then he understands where Roger is going with all of this. "So you want to hit him with a critical mass of Conqueror's haki?" And Roger says yes. And then they do it and it works. But I think we have seen this, how shall we call it, mass effect before, and it comes to us courtesy of Luffy's Gear 4. The reason why Luffy was only able to access this form temporarily had nothing to do with his physical attributes, but everything to do with the probable mass of his haki. As I suspect that by default, Luffy imbued this form with such a colossal mass of armament haki that it drained him much more rapidly than any other haki user we'd seen. And as a result of that increased mass, it also allowed him to hit a hell of a lot harder than any other user. So the gamble that Roger and Garp are talking about here is almost certainly along the same lines. Inject all of the mass, lose access to Haki, and just hope that it works out. And if so, that means that this gamble is something that Luffy takes on by default in almost every Gear 4 fight that he's involved in. Luffy generally doesn't mess around when he activates Gear 4. It is time to finish things, or at least that's his hope. It doesn't always work out, and when it doesn't, he loses access to Haki for a certain period of time. But all of this is a more in-depth explanation of saying that we need to hit him harder. It's the meme. When punching hard doesn't work, so I enact a brilliantly concocted plan to punch harder. So I'm pretty sure that this isn't some sort of untapped next level Haki system that we've revealed. I mean, I never say never, it might be, but in Japanese, it's not some sort of fancy poetic word. It's the very straightforward scientific word for mass that we're using. And to me, the most fun thing that's come out of this discussion is the idea that Luffy has been using what most top tier fighters believe to be a horrendously risky strategy, and that is why we love Luffy. He doesn't hold back. He's gonna smack you with everything he's got, and that's just kind of that. Where is Gloriosa? Is she safe? Does Oda remember she exists? Or is she no longer needed now that the Shaki Rayleigh Roger triangle is resolved? So Gloriosa did make a one-panel appearance in chapter 1165. Notice how Gloriosa tried to slide right into the hierarchy here. She loved Roger, but knows that Roger isn't interested, and Rayleigh's just gotten together with bestie Shaki. So what next? I guess we'll settle for the third in charge of the Roger Pirates. Yes, Copacabana, missionary of love. You like love and such, don't you? Well, I'm one of those. Take me with you. And I have seen a fair few complaints that the action on God Valley is being too short. For me, that aspect is fine, but if I had to identify one thing that I wanted just a little bit more of, it's Gloriosa. She has always been a bit of a side piece in this story, relentlessly dumping her affections onto Roger, but I did expect her to do a little bit more during God Valley itself, given her relationship with Shaki. I was thinking that Gloriosa may play some part in freeing her, and I don't think that's just my headcanon, because in chapter 1160, Gloriosa was set on being the very first person to reach Shaki, albeit so that Roger would be grateful to her. Still, that's what she said, and that's what she didn't do, as we proceeded to never see her again until it was time to leave the island. So I have absolutely no idea what Gloriosa actually did during the God Valley incident. And she's not the only one either. Barbell was a fairly prominently staged member of the Rox Pirates, and I also think that he disappeared after chapter 1160. At the same time though, I don't think that anyone was expecting much from him. Gloriosa was a much more prominent character. So yeah, I do think there's a missed opportunity for something to have happened with her here. It doesn't need to be given a whole chapter's focus, just a handful of panels, but hey, maybe the anime will choose to expand on Gloriosa's role a bit more. I'm not unemployed, I swear. Well, I don't believe you. What you need to do now? Post your job description and your credit card details in the comments below for me to confirm. Considering the voice of all things in this chapter, will Luffy be able to hear Dory and Broggy when we return to Elbaf? It's possible, but I was thinking that it would probably be the other way around, that Dory and Broggy would be able to hear Luffy. The voice of all things is a very tricky concept to talk about because we don't know how it works really, but in theory you need to have the voice of all things to hear the voice of all things. So traditionally when we see stuff like Zunesha and the Sea King speaking, it is just the voice users who can hear them, or speaking to each other like how Luffy was communicating with Momonosuke whilst he was drowning. That feels more like what Rox was doing with Roger and Garp. However, at the same time, Luffy was able to make his voice heard by non-voice users, as the Heart Pirates found and rescued Luffy by following the sound of his voice of all things in the water. So the problem with Luffy being able to hear the voices of Dory and Broggy is that they are not voice users, at least not that we know of, but at the very least, Luffy's voice should be able to reach them because we've seen him do that before. Hey YouTube man, am I your only Saudi viewer? You are not. So according to my stat, Saudi Arabia is the 20th highest viewed country of this channel, which translated into people is about 26,000 Saudi Arabian viewers in the past 30 days, which I think is extremely high considering that this is an English-speaking channel. But from what I understand, One Piece is absolutely massive in Saudi Arabia, so much so that the Crown Prince met with Toei staff members and even got Oda's autograph when he was in Japan in 2016. And also, sorry for the slight detour here, but this is something that I've known for a while, but I've never really had an appropriate place to put in a video. As it turns out, Saudi Arabia actually owns a 6.0 0.03% stake in Toei Animation through their public investment fund, which is more than likely why the Crown Prince was there, but he is allegedly a huge One Piece fan as well, as an increasing number of world leaders seem to be. Could Silver Axe be the random man from East Blue with sunglasses? Very interesting. So longtime viewers of this channel should know exactly who we're talking about, but in case you don't, in chapter 550, there is a mysterious man with an eye-grabbingly detailed design shown in East Blue. The Paramount War is about to happen, and we've got a younger man calling Whitebeard an old-fashioned dinosaur, and our elderman is saying that if Whitebeard is wise, he won't show up to Marineford, because what is the life of one ace versus your whole fleet? And ever since the moment that chapter came out, there was rampant speculation that this man was Gaban. That's because Silver's Rayleigh had been introduced the year before, and the fan base was still caught up in this Roger Pirates fever. We were looking for them everywhere. And I won't say that he looks amazingly like Kyo or Silver Axe, but he's not that far away either, I suppose. Both characters do have this Wano flair about them. And remember that Silver Axe isn't actually the bulky dude that we're used to seeing. His true form is actually this scrawny little guy that we've never gotten a clear look at. So the old man being more of a regular sized guy actually fits with who Kyo actually is. But I don't know, I'm not personally sold that this is the same guy, because the most simple explanation for East Blue Old Man has always been that on that day, Oda just felt like drawing something a bit more detailed, as this was during the times where Oda cited that he often let his imagination get carried away. But you know what, if it is the same man, then we will probably find out very soon, maybe this time next year in an SBS. You know, I was just thinking about this, but the rules of a Davy backfight where a member of the opposing crew has to join your crew is very similar to the effect of a Domi Reversi. Yeah, it sure is. Both of them are obviously games, although one of them is a much more consensual game. But one of the main tragic aspects about both Domi Reversi and the Davy backfight is that they both rob you of your dream and ambition. Domi Reversi warps your mind into an emu slave, whilst the Davy backfight forces you to abandon the crew that you chose to set sail with to fulfill your dream. And now you have to abandon that dream and dedicate yourself to the dream of your new captain, whatever that may be. A fox in many cases. Just as everyone affected by Domi Reversi is now forced to dedicate themselves to Emu's dream to create Mu's world. I can't believe you didn't select the Davy backfight comment in which it was suggested that it was somehow related to Domi Reversi. Everyone says Skypia is too long. I would agree it's long ASF, but the payoff is just way more than the investment, especially because 1,000 episodes in, it's proving to be the most important arc in the story. I do always find it funny when anyone says that Skypia was too long, because here is a crazy stat. Skypia was 66 chapters long, which is the longest single arc in pre-time skip One Piece, remembering that Water 7 and Enies Lobby, they are separate arcs, but not too far behind in second place is the Alabasta arc on 63 chapters. That's Alabasta arc, not the Alabasta saga. Just the stuff that happened on Alabasta was 63 chapters. So Skypia isn't functionally longer than that, and the overall saga is significantly shorter. Also in the anime, this is wild, but Thriller Bark, despite being 18 chapters shorter than Skypia, somehow ends up being 2 episodes longer than Skypia, because that is the point in the anime where you can really feel the need for filler setting in. So I think that this is a manga or anime perspective. If you read the manga, Skypia probably feels like more of a drag, but if you watch the anime, you have to believe that Thriller Bark was more of a drag. Mathematically, it's just the only way one can feel. But obviously Skypia gets a bit of a bad rap, because sure, it's about the same length as Alabasta, but Alabasta was much more integrated into the world of One Piece that we knew, whereas Skypia almost starts telling the story again from zero. It takes the time to focus on an aspect of the One Piece world that we really hadn't touched up to that point, and I can see how it might initially feel like an entire season of filler to some people, but personally, I was loving Skypia the first time around, because I was really taken in by the adventure and the mystery of the island. I found it quite nice to put the concerns of the Blue Sea to the side for a bit, and explore this new dimension of the world. And Skypia is what taught me to just trust wherever Oda takes us, whether that be a haunted island, a half hot, half cold desolate landscape, a future island, 4 years of Wano, now Elbaf, and of course whatever comes after. Because even Long Ring Long Land is now paying off in the greatest of ways, and I can't wait to see where the adventure takes us next. And if you're curious about that, I actually have a whole video of the 6 possibilities that we could go to after Elbaf waiting for you right here. Cross Guild are the modern reincarnation of the Rox Pirates, currently being led by the genius jester Buggy the Clown, and flanked on either side by the world's greatest swordsman Turacule Mihawk, as well as a very bad Sandman Sir Crocodile. And in much the same way that the Straw Hat Pirates are set up to be the modern incarnation of the Roger Pirates, or at least the top three of them are, with Luffy, Zoro, and Sanji taking after Roger, Rayleigh, and Scopogawan respectively, Cross Guild are our modern day Rox Pirates, which you would think would naturally fall to the Blackbeard Pirates, but not really. Despite being his flesh and blood son, Blackbeard so far has shown very little resemblance to Rox outside of aesthetics, and his assorted crew members have shown very little resemblance to the Rox Pirates members. However, Oda has been working hard, ever so hard, to have this legendary legacy inherited by a Buggy. And this is because of reasons, such as the fact that you may think Zebek's name was taken from a three-masted vessel of the Mediterranean, but Vietnam has something to say to you. And that something is Zebe, or however you pronounce it, which in Vietnamese literally translates as a buggy. That's genuinely true. It's crazy. And with that, I could just end the video right here and now. Because what am I going to do? Argue with Vietnam? That didn't work out so well the last time we tried it. And long before we got to the reveal of Blackbeard being the son of Rox, there were endless theories that Buggy was Rox's son. And you know what? To be fair, there still are. It's just that all of those theories have now been renamed to Buggy is Rox's second other son, Clown. A theory which would be completely absurd if not for story lord Eiichiro Oda deliberately and literally drawing a comparison between the two, with the bounty posters of Rox and Buggy having the exact same pose. Rox's bounty is particularly terrifying because it looks as if he's reaching out to grab the photographer. It's a lot like a "this is the last thing you see before you die" kind of shot, whereas Buggy's bounty photo looks a lot more staged. I reckon that this is a pose that he has thought long and hard about, and Buggy is using his very proficient skills as an actor to portray the same kind of last thing you see before you die vibe. However, there is something distinctly superficial about it. Does this confirm that Buggy is Rox's second son? No, absolutely not. Not even close, mate. But there is an actual connection being made here. So here's a crazy idea. Roxy Zebek is this name that has apparently been lost to the world, but there are plenty, and I mean plenty, of old guard who either knew Rox personally or knew of him. So what are the chances that when someone was thinking about a bounty image, someone brought Rox's old bounty to Buggy's attention, and what he started doing was placing himself within convenient range of marine photographers, and he just started making this pose, hoping to produce a bounty as formidable looking as one of the most infamous pirates to have ever lived. Or at least he would be infamous if he hadn't been thoroughly scrubbed from history. But that is the most brilliant part about this plan. No one could even accuse Buggy of plagiarism because no one knows the original shot that he is copying from. No one except the man who chooses the bounty images himself, Mr. Big News Morgans. We've spoken about this in other videos, but Morgans has sole discretion over which photos get printed onto bounties. All the world government get to decide are the numbers, but Morgans has the ability to portray pirates in whichever way best fits his desired narrative for them. And so there is something to the idea that Morgans chose this photo of Buggy because he is one of the people who remembers the days of Rox. In fact, those are the days where Morgans got his start and got his newspaper off the ground. He was an integral aspect of the God Valley incident, and it really was that one incident that propelled Morgans into the reality truth warping abilities that he has today solely through the control of information. And Morgans' story right, the reality that he wants to create is all about who is going to become the next Pirate King. And from what Morgan said to Stussy during Whole Cake Island, his bet is on one of the worst generation members. And assuming that Bird hasn't changed his bird mind, what Morgans is now trying to do is to create a rival for that future Pirate King. And we have a template to do exactly this. Because who were Roger's greatest rivals? Well, we have a Garp, we have a Whitebeard, and we have a Rock. And Garp doesn't have a historical bounty to base something off. That's not a problem though, because Morgans is more than happy to build up the story of Kobe, the new hero of the Marines. But with Whitebeard, that appears to have been used as the inspiration for Blackbeard's bounty, as these photos were shot at the same angle. So Morgans already has that rival covered, which only leaves us with Rox, and so Morgans may have used that template for Buggy. And look, I know that this sounds logistically weird and just weird in general, but if there is any character that something so convoluted and media intensive could happen to, it is Buggy. Because consider this. What if Morgans, wanting to create this reality, sends one of his photographers to Buggy's island, stating that he wants to do a photo shoot with Buggy Buggy. Any other emperor would probably reject this. In fact, actually, I don't know, maybe Blackbeard would take him up. He seems like the kind of guy who'd be down for an impromptu photo shoot, but Buggy would 100% cooperate because he, more so than anyone, knows that the perception of power is just as, if not more important than having actual power itself. And so Morgans gives his photographer instructions to hit this specific pose so that we can weave that Rox narrative into the next generation. To milk a cow that the world has long since forgotten about, and to sell it as a fresh product, and go on to artificially create not just the Rox Zebek of this generation, but also the Rox Pirates of this generation through Cross Guild. Because if it were not for the decisions of Big News Morgans, as well as Buggy's crew who printed the Cross Guild poster, Buggy would not be the leader of this group, and Mihawk and Crocodile would not be publicly subservient to him. The real-life Rox was able to earn his crew members through Davy backfights and keep them by his side via charisma. He was a man capable of doing the impossible by keeping all of these clashing high-ranking personalities together, and Buggy, well, he's the exact opposite of that. Yes, he does have his God and El-given charisma, at least with his own crew, but Buggy's cross-guild officers have been given to him by Morgans, gifted, not necessarily because this is what Morgans was intending to do, but because the publicity is now so far out of hand that Crocodile, who is also out of at least one hand, and Mihawk have no choice but to keep up the charade. Which, for all of his many flaws, Buggy understands that. And that is why he publicly broadcast his tearful and honest desire to become the next Pirate King, which is now something that Mihawk and Crocodile have to work towards, or else they'll lose everything that's been built here. For Crocodile, that is an extensive business and future ambitions of doing something world domination, and for Mihawk, what he's built is peace and quiet, as Cross Guild may be the one location in the world that won't see him endlessly hunted by Marines. Whatever the case may be for each individual member, Buggy, Mihawk, and Crocodile are now bound together by circumstance, and they have accidentally created the beginning of what could be the most powerful pirate crew of this generation. And that is because Buggy is a beast of momentum. Once a scheme surrounding him gets a-rolling, whether Buggy likes it or not, it is not gonna stop. Like the Impel down prisoners mistaking Buggy for a deity, leading to him becoming a warlord, then an emperor, and very potentially the future pirate king. And I think that this sort of momentum is only going to attract more and more high-level followers. Followers such as Gecko Moria, the most obvious next Cross Guild candidate. I've covered this in other videos before, but in Buggy's Viviacard databook entry, there is an early sketch of Cross Guild which features Perona as a member, and that still feels like the next natural move. Perona has rescued Moria from Hachinosu, and there's not really anywhere else left for them to go. And with Moria's alleged Kozuki lineage, he could be extremely useful when it comes to certain tasks like reading poneglyphs. But Moria could also end up being quite important if a race for Punk Hazard ever develops, as Moria may be the most qualified person in the world when it comes to reanimating frozen ancient giant corpses, so he's quite a natural fit for that lingering plot of the ancient giants as well. Because in 2025, Moria has gone from forgotten about reject warlord to quite possibly one of the most important characters in Endgame One Piece. He'd be a big get for Cross Guild, as would a certain Doflamingo, a character who is sometimes dismissed as a Cross Guild candidate due to his status of being confined in level 6 of Impel Down. And that's because invading Impel Down is seen as a very difficult task, which it is. A task that Blackbeard and Luffy managed to accomplish. And with the help of both Buggy and Crocodile, who know the layout of the prison because they were part of the first breakout, and with the power of Mihawk backing them, I think that any concerns about not being able to successfully break into Impel Down very much come down to a skill issue on the part of Cross Guild. They've got the power, they've got the strategy, and they've got the knowledge to do it. But we don't actually necessarily even need to break in, because we're already planning a second breakout. We still have the unresolved plot thread of Bon Clay becoming the new queen of level 5.5 on the cover of chapter 666, and originally Emporio Ivankov was planted into Impel Down to gather forces to break out as part of a grand revolutionary army plan. And we don't know if Bon Clay is following that revolutionary plan or if New Karmaland has become its own thing, but there will be a second breakout at some stage led at least partially by these dudes. But also in his most recent appearance, Doflamingo has accurately identified to Vice Warden Magellan that they should move to higher ground, as if Emu starts making too many islands never existed, then Impel Down will very quickly be swallowed into the ocean. So it might not be a break-in or breakout, it could be as simple as Magellan and Hannibal deciding that they need to evacuate. During that, chaos ensues. Doflamingo, he gets free, and he needs something to do. And just like Moria, Doflamingo doesn't have a huge huge amount of options to survive on his own. He does, however, have a keen sense for alliances, as during Marineford, Doflamingo was already very eager to team up with Crocodile. And notice that Doflamingo didn't say something arrogant like, "You should come and work for me, Croco Man." Not at all. Doflamingo, he wanted a partnership with Crocodile. He wanted equality, which disgusted Crocodile. Equality. Ugh. And he snapped back with, "Don't pretend we're equals." And then he offered Doflamingo a spot as one of his henchmen, with Doflamingo replying that he thought that being in prison may have humbled Crocodile, but apparently not. Which is funny because Doflamingo is currently in prison, and I do think that that has genuinely humbled him. Every time we cut back to Doflamingo, he's generally speaking a lot of sense. And so what I'm thinking is that at some stage in the future, after Doflamingo gets out of Impel Down, we are going to have a replay of this scene where it may be Crocodile offering Doflamingo a partnership with Crossguild. And I do think that Doflamingo fits in pretty well, by which I mean Doflamingo's personality will not fit in well at all and will probably clash with everyone else in Crossguild. But that is exactly what the Rox Pirates were. They were a group of mismatched personalities drawn together by fate, and there is this wondersome panel in Chapter 0 which depicts the day of Roger's execution. And Oda gives us close-ups of 7 notable figures who were there. We have Shanks and Dragon in the bottom right-hand side of the page, but smack bang in the middle, we see this lovely lineup of Buggy, Mihawk, Crocodile, Moria, and Doflamingo. And my headcanon-y dream is that this becomes the foreshadowing for the lineup of Crossguild. But that doesn't exclude more members joining like Boa Hancock, and I always encounter a lot of resistance when I suggest her as a potential member of Crossguild. And fair enough, it may not happen. She hates men and she loves her Luffy man, neither of which are conducive to joining this particular crew. However, if Oda is going for the reincarnation of the Rox Pirates idea, then Boa Hancock is one of the clearest possible candidates because she would fill the role of Gloriosa. Rox Dizabek managed to recruit a Kuja Empress, and it was a very big deal to the world at the time as the Kuja were global idols. And joining Crossguild doesn't necessarily mean that Hancock would be working against Luffy. I don't think she would ever do that. At least not any more than she already was as a warlord with the woke government. Plus Hancock, she has a rather urgent problem to deal with, which is that Amazon Lily is extremely vulnerable right now. It was invaded by both Blackbeard and the Marines, and Silver's Rayleigh has stated that he alone will not be able to protect them from a serious threat. So Hancock, she's got to join forces with someone for the sake of her people, and if Crossguild keeps gaining momentum with all of these names, then they could be the way to go. Meanwhile, another wildcard choice may be a Trafalgar Law. He was a warlord, and if we do go back to that early sketch of Crossguild that I showed earlier, to the left of Perona is a character who I personally think is Mihawk, but I can see why others want to identify him as Trafalgar Law. Again, I think it's Mihawk, but Law, he's still a pretty good candidate. The Heart Pirates, they've been defeated. The narrator ended their journey, and I don't think that they're going to be able to remount their campaign. We also don't know what happened to the rest of the crew except for Law and Beppo. If everyone else was captured by the Blackbeard pirates, then Law and Beppo are going to need help. Possibly even urgent help, and in lieu of being able to contact the Straw Hats, Crossguild could be the solution. Law's 3 billion berry bounty is also on the same level as Buggy and Mihawk, so he would be seen as such a massive gain. And while Law may have lost his poneglyph rubbings, he does potentially have the important piece of information about the ancient giants on Punk Hazard, because that's where he used to live. I really don't think that Law is that crazy of a choice, and just like Hancock, joining Crossguild doesn't automatically make Law an enemy of Luffy, but the only way I could see Law being a no-go is if Doflamingo did join because of their, history. It would be a pretty rough ask for both of them to join Crossguild, but also, who knows? Oda does these weird and unpredictable things that seem impossible, but then get perfectly explained away. Which brings us to Edward Weevil, the alleged son of Whitebeard. His strength has been directly compared to that of a young Whitebeard, described as monstrous, and he may be one of the single most powerful physical fighters alive today. He just often gets forgotten about because we haven't done anything with his story yet. But this Edward Weevil fellow, he follows Boa Hancock logic. That being, if we are remaking the Rox Pirates, then he is the most obvious one to fill the role of Whitebeard. Getting Weevil on side would be such a clear mirroring, and Weevil also kind of plays into that Rox Pirates we have at home effect, with Buggy being a substanceless rip-off of Rox, and Weevil likely being a botched clone of Whitebeard. And at the time of Egghead Island, which was about a day or two ago at this point on Elbaf, Miss Buckingham Stussy stated that Admiral Greenbull showed up and captured Weevil, which is both good news and bad bad news. The good news is that right now it is possible that Weevil is still in transport and hasn't been confined in Impel Down as of yet, so there's an opportunity to intercept that and offer him a place in Cross Guild. Maybe his mother will even lobby Cross Guild to go and save him because she loves him. But the bad news is that you would need to be prepared to fight a Marine Admiral to get him, which neither Buggy nor Crocodile can really do, and Mihawk probably doesn't really want to do. So it may actually be easier to wait until Weevil ends up in Impel Down and then break him out alongside Doflamingo and get a 2-for-1 deal going. Or even a 3-for-1 deal, as if Weevil joins, then Miss Buckingham Stussy also would, and she was an actual OG Rox Pirates member. But as for Warlords who definitely will not join, we have Jinbei because he's a Straw Hat, Blackbeard because he's an Emperor, Hanafuda because he's dead, Kuma because he can't do much of anything at the moment, and if Lilith did restore Kuma, then I imagine he'd go back to the Revolutionary Army. Or not that, just sail with Bonney, have fun. Have the life that he never got. But I do focus on Warlords specifically because I think they are the most likely to be headhunted by Crocodile, which is exactly what happened with Mihawk. Crocodile was the one who called him up, and I do love that Crocodile just so happens to have Mihawk's personal snail phone number. Those two have some sort of personal history. But after getting embroiled in Buggy's Pirate King scheme, Crocodile may see the need to buff his numbers and reach out to the other former warlords like he did with Mihawk. And look, why is as full of a set as warlords as possible even important? It's because the 7 warlords of the sea have been called one of the 3 great powers throughout the entire series up to their dissolution. The reason why Whitebeard couldn't win at Marineford was because he had 2 of the 3 great powers against him. But in the final war, 2 of the 3 great powers will be against the Marines. So imagine this, and this may be an actual spoiler for the final war, but Cross Guild hypesomely rocks up, intentional pun there. We see a lone clown on the battlefield with a sense of arrogance that he can't quite back up himself, and he's quickly joined by his officers, Crocodile and Mihawk, and behind them emerges the tank that is Edward Weevil, whilst out of elsewhere comes Don Quixote Doflamingo, and behind him maybe a Trafalgar Law, but also maybe not. Not that anyone cares, because all eyes are then stolen by Empress Boa Hancock, and somewhere in the background we've got Moria, and Cross Guild have now arrived with an impossibly stacked crew, evoking the legendary Rox Pirates, just hopefully with a bit of a better ending. Why are you watching this? I warned you. So here's a taste of what you're going to get in this video. In this video, we will reveal 4 hidden characters, answer 3 penis questions, detail 2 Eiichiro Oda love letters, as well as finally discover the speed limit of the Okama Way, discover how Oda's obsession with one pop star changed the entire course of One Piece, and reveal Whitebeard's intimate fixation on a certain item. By which I mean something I can't say in the first 2 minutes of a video or it'll get demonetized. But this is all canon. There is something about Whitebeard that you probably didn't even notice, but once you do, you cannot unsee it. And like everything else in this video, it was confirmed as canon by the author himself. So as most seasoned fictional pirate enjoyers will know, Eiichiro Oda tells the story of One Piece through 2 mediums. One is the manga, and the other is the companion pieces to the manga, specifically the SBS question segments. In fact, I often complain that Oda tells far too much of the story in these companion pieces. But something you will have never heard about in any other video is the sheer amount of useless information that Oda dumps into these glorified story toilets. Whether you like it or not, you're gonna learn something today. And I promise that this knowledge will do nothing except take up valuable mental real estate that you could have used to house something useful. So this is your fault, and let's begin. In the SBS of Volume 19, Eiichiro Oda is posed a very serious question. Oda-sensei, I found something rather surprising about the delivery man on pages 117 to 118 of Volume 18. It says hard-boiled on his t-shirt, but on page 69, those are the same people, right? And his t-shirt says full-boiled. What's up with him? Tell me! Very well, I shall tell you. This guy's name is Mr. Mello, and he has a surprisingly detailed backstory. He was one of the Baroque Works Billions who killed Mr. 11 after he was captured by Smoker. But Mr. Mello has a character arc to go on here, which all started 4 years ago. He and his fellow Billions were carting dance powder in Nanohana. The cart broke, and then they ran like the assorted cowards they are. But very importantly, if you zoom in on his shirt, the kanji says half-boiled. Meanwhile, when he makes his reappearance 4 years later, it says full-boiled, or fledged in the Viz translation, and this is what is known as character development. Mr. Mello then makes the mistake of trying to capture Ace, and he destroys all of them with a fire fist, thus I suppose making him boiled over and completing his 4-year character arc. Congratulations, you now know Mr. Mello's full story arc, but as a result of knowing this, you've probably forgotten how to cook. But if not for these segments, we would never know about hidden gems like Mr. Mello, nor would we get to ask Oda questions such as, on Clahado's clothing, there's a symbol that looks like poop. Does it stand for poop, or does it have some other meaning? To which Oda just replied, it's poop. And along the same lines, what happened to the key Choo-Choo swallowed in Volume 2? And what the reader is referring to here is Chapter 12, where Choo-Choo swallows the key to Luffy's cage, assumedly as an act of retribution because Luffy poked him in the eyes. And just in case you've ever wondered what became of that key, well, it came out, shiny and brown. Of course, Oda isn't always accommodating when it comes to weird questions. In Volume 7, a reader asked, does Shanks like me? And Oda said, I don't care. And on that note, it's time for penis question number 1. Oda-sensei, since Luffy is a Gomu human, does that mean his penis can stretch too? I don't know why penis is in quotation marks, actually. But the answer is that yes, it can. I couldn't help but notice something. On page 137 of Volume 15, the woman appears to have spring onions in her basket. 3 of them. But the same lady later appears on page 162. Is it me, or does she have a bunch more of them? If she's got so many, does it mean they're having roasted onions for dinner or onion stew? Just tell me what she was going to cook. So a truly fascinating discovery here. Drum Island, typically thought of as Chopper's arc, actually has a spring onion or shallot depending on your you. It has a spring onion subplot that goes unnoticed by far too many people. And this woman in question is named Negikuma Maria, which basically translates as Spring Onion Bear Maria. She's 45 years old, born on November 14th, and her English voice actor is Wendy Powell, who also voices Miss Merry Christmas. So she's sort of like the go-to animal woman fusion voice. But what exactly is Negikuma Maria's endgame here? Well, whilst the Straw Hats and everyone else worked to free Drum Island from Warpole, according to Oda, Negikuma Maria was working in tandem to gather ingredients in order to bake a spring onion cake, which I'm sure went about as well as it sounds. As a bonus useless fact, in the 4Kids dub, Negikuma Maria was named Big Mama, which would have caused quite the confusing situation if Big Mom ever appeared. Because that's 2 big mothers and that's too many. There can only be one. Question: if Luffy is 7,200 funky Gomu Gomus, does that mean that Sanji is about 8,500 funky Ero Eros? Answer: oh no, not at all. He can get at least 930 fairy tale Ero Eros. There is no context to this at all. You're not missing any information. That's just how this exchange went. Question: is there a mirror on Alvida's ship? The implication here being that Alvida has perhaps misjudged her attractiveness due to a lack of evidence. Answer: something tells me she doesn't have a mirror. And this absurdly obscure piece of information is referenced in the live action One Piece because the very first shot of Alvida is looking at herself in a full body mirror. Question: does Sanji-san like to say shit? Answer: no. He loves to say shit. Glad we clarified that. But from time to time, readers also have a wide variety of helpful suggestions for One Piece. You know, to take the pressure off Oda from being the sole creative all the time. Suggestions such as, Oda-sensei, I thought of a great move. 1. Luffy stretches out his arm. 2. Zoro cuts his arm off. 3. The arm shoots away. Note, the move can only be used twice. And speaking of combat, in the early days of One Piece, Oda actually used to get a lot of power scaling questions. And one of them was the classic flat-out, who's stronger, Zoro or Sanji? If Zoro and Sanji had a serious fight, who would win? Zoro beat Mr. One, so he's stronger, right? And now this right here was a bit of a tricky situation for Mr. Oda-san, who handled it with all of the poise and grace we've come to expect of him, by claiming that he misheard the question as, if Zoro and Sanji had a dick fight, who would win? And then refuses to answer due to the uncouth nature of the question. However, this intentional misunderstanding is because the Japanese word for serious is gachinko. However, gachinko means dick, and Japanese is a very, very dick language, which might explain all of the questions such as, can Buggy split his down there? And the answer is yes, he can. And now for a segment I like to call Weird Letters to Eiichiro Oda. How are ya, Odachi? I know how much you must like getting butt naked, so this must be a favorite season for you. Yes. I just love getting completely naked. In the summertime, after I take a bath, I just run straight outside. And when the girls' softball team running... This is such a weird letter. And when the girls' softball team running on the sidewalk looks over at me, they say, yep, it's really summer now. Heartwarming. That is a genuine letter that a fan sent Oda, and Oda proceeded to publish in volume 25 of the second highest selling comic book in human history. Good stuff. These letters often do get a bit weirdly personal though. I have a secret question to discuss with you, Master Oda. Brackets, this is a normal letter. Closed brackets. That's good to know. Please times 10 tell me your home address. I hope this finds you in good health. Seems like a perfectly reasonable request. Although I don't know how Oda's love wife would feel about this, because we've also had a letter from her as well. Welcome home, my love. Would you like dinner? Or take a bath? Or maybe you'd rather have... And that's where this letter ends, signed from Love Wife 2. We have yet to hear from Love Wife 1. She seems much less inclined to publicly disclose her details in One Piece volumes. But also, aliens. Salutations, I am an Earthlian. And then there's a little asterisk there, which defines an Earthlian as a half-Earthling, half-alien. I am an Earthlian who lives in the same house that Usopp's father Yasopp's friend's brother's girlfriend lived in a long time ago. And Oda actually responds to this one, but he just says, wow. So there's a lot of these, but there is one letter that was very revealing, and it tells us something about Oda that would go on to greatly influence One Piece. And this time, I'm not joking, this is actually relevant, sort of. To Odachi, I am your betrothed. When are we going to be married? Should it be November 1st? We're going to kiss in the marriage ceremony, right? I'm so nervous, kiss. Actually, I'm Nami Amoro's little sister. Now that is the last line that we're concerned with, because Nami Amuro is a name that you might be familiar with if you've watched the One Piece anime. So firstly, this letter was sent in 1999. Not only that, it was actually sent before the anime had even begun airing, which is interesting because Nami Amuro would go on to sing the openings Fight Together and Hope in 2011 and 2017 respectively. And also she had a special track called Black Makeup for the One Piece TV special Adventure of Nebulandia, which is the one where Foxy briefly joins the Straw Hats. But Nami Amuro also had a special animation featuring her interacting with the Straw Hats. All of this is to say that I think that Eiichiro Oda might have had a bit of a thing for Nami Amuro, which may have been known by readers, hence this letter trying to entice Oda by claiming to be Nami Amuro's little sister. Now, one really fun challenge Oda undertook was when he was asked to draw all of the characters with his left hand, which resulted in this Nami, Zoro, and Luffy, which at the time of this recording is live-action actress Emily Rudd's Twitter profile picture. But having gotten a taste of delicious power, readers soon thoroughly abused Oda's hospitality. Shortly after, Oda was asked to draw all of the characters with his foot, which resulted in this. Guess which character that is. And this also proved so popular that Oda was then asked to draw the characters with his mouth, which actually isn't bad at all. I think that worked out much better than the foot. Also, in the early days of SBS segments, readers basically dumped their chores on Oda. For example, there was a student who needed to make a class schedule, and then Oda just went and made a class schedule for him. And when alerted to the fact that this schedule wouldn't work for all schools, Oda said to send him the specifics and he would adjust it as necessary. And sometimes you can really feel the passion in Oda's answers, because sometimes he goes absolutely above and beyond to explain incredibly minor details about his world. When someone asked what the pistols in One Piece are called, not only did Oda reveal their names, but he even drew a detailed diagram of exactly how a flintlock pistol functions, like a textbook. But then again, sometimes people also write in to just complain. I just want to say this to Mr. 8. You're a disgrace to the saxophone. What's with that posture? Your embouchure is pathetic. And at least wear a strap. Think about what I said. Now go. Sometimes the SBS is kind of like the YouTube comment section before YouTube existed. Then again, in volume 23, another hidden gem is unlocked. It was noticed that in chapter 206, Tashigi strikes down a man who has "I love Miss Valentine" on the back of his jacket. According to Oda, this is because Baroque Works has over 2,000 members, as well as a series of fan clubs dedicated to the upper numbered and named agents. Miss Valentine is only one. But to join a Baroque Works fan club, you need to send your name, age, and address to the Whiskey Peak AFC Agent Fan Club headquarters, which you can't do that anymore because Zoro destroyed it. But we were not prepared for just how far down this particular rabbit hole we were about to go, because there's also a sub-question of how Baroque Works agents take vacations. Remembering that this organization has existed for like at least half a decade by the time we meet them, so it's a fully established corporate hierarchy with paid leave. Oda joked that Crocodile sends his employees to the Winter Festival in Hokkaido, but later corrected that he needs to book flights and vacations for each member separately, since no one agent is allowed to know who any of the others are except for your partner. So that's up to 2,000 individual holidays that Sir Crocodile is booking and managing per year for his criminal enterprise. What a solid CEO. This is why he's the management behind Cross Guild. But the Baroque Works curiosities continue. If Mr. 7 became Mr. 6, what would happen to his face? Another very important question, as Mr. 7's face is designed entirely around the number 7. His nose, his eyebrows, his shoes, and even the gun. The latter two I know aren't part of the face, let's forget about that. But his identity is glued to the number 7. So as a result, Oda was forced to draw Mr. 7 if he ever got a promotion to Mr. 6. Also, fun fact, as most people do now know, he was not the original Mr. 7. The original was killed by Zoro before the series began and made an appearance in live-action One Piece. But recently it was revealed that Oda actually made a full proper sketch of the original Mr. 7 to make it easier for production, which I think is really cool. Oda has also been asked on multiple occasions what species he is. The speculation has been published that Oda is a dog, an alien, and a hippo. In fact, one reader asked if Oda wanted to raise a hippo that the reader had found on the side of the road. Oda, however, declined this offer. Question: Hey, Oda-sensei, when Dr. Hiroluck got naked, why did there just so happen to be snow obscuring the view of his most special area? Answer: if it didn't just so happen to obscure the view, you'd see his weenie. That is the exact quote. Eiichiro Oda used the word weenie. And questions like this are, unsurprisingly, a bit of a trend. How is it that the spikes from Miss Doublefinger's Toge Toge fruit can also grow from outside her body? Brackets, her clothes, that is. Answer: huh? Are you referring to the fact that spikes would rip the clothes? If I did that, wouldn't this become an extraordinarily erotic manga? And if I did that, then I'd have to draw it that way on book covers. So then everyone would be super embarrassed when trying to buy it at the bookstore. You want that? And to answer Oda's question, yes, I do think the reader wants that. But let's talk about Whitebeard now. I made some big promises at the beginning of this video, and after this, you will not see him the same way again. A reader spotted something rather curious in chapter 234, which is the introduction of Whitebeard. However, around Whitebeard is what can only be described as a harem of nurses, all wearing leopard print tights. Standard hospital issue, I'm sure, but the reader essentially inquires as to whether the nurses in leopard tights is, how shall we say, Whitebeard's specific intimate trigger, to which Oda said yes. Whitebeard's wish/mandate was that all of his palliative care nurses were dressed like this. Oda also goes on to add, I hear that there are more hospitals where nurses wear pants. That's sad, I'm gonna cry now. And now for the question we've all been waiting for. What's the speed limit on the Okama Way? Well, according to Oda, the law states that if you go over 300 mascaras per hour, then you can expect to be musk-arrested. So I hope that you've gained absolutely nothing from this video. I warned you with the title and the thumbnail that you did not need to watch it. If you're still watching it, why? Let me know why. Because I have over 1,000 videos with actual One Piece information that you can and should know. But this video was just dedicated to the useless deluge that Oda floods these volumes with, things that I need to sift through to give you like the actual information. So I hope you've enjoyed it, a brief glimpse into my daily life.